My stepmother destroyed all my mother's treasured belongings and sent me photos of the ashes, laughing as she did it. My anger erupted like a raging fire. This nightmare of a stepmother not only burned my late mother's keepsakes, but also caused my dad to end up in the hospital. Our relationship has always been rocky, and I'll never forget the night she drunkenly boasted about her actions. I burned it all. It was just junk, she said. You need to let go of your mom's memory. Think of it as a favor. I was speechless and just hung up. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a flood of messages from her, photos of ashes with laughing emojis. At that time, my dad and I were camping, so I woke him to share the news. He thought I was joking, but when I showed him the evidence, he went pale. He rushed outside his tent, clutching his chest as he had a heart attack. I called for an airlift, and it took 15 minutes for the helicopter to arrive. While we waited, my stepmother kept calling, but I ignored her. I held my father's hand tightly the whole time. He made it to the hospital and was taken to the ICU, where machines surrounded him. I sat by his side, watching him breathe, terrified at the thought of losing him. I wanted to be strong, but guilt overwhelmed me. I kept thinking that if I hadn't told him, he might have been fine, even though I knew that wasn't true. After what felt like forever, the doctors stabilized him. They said he was lucky to survive, but he remained in a fragile condition. Any more stress could be life-threatening. 4 days, I stayed close to him, anxious every time I stepped out of the room, fearing something might happen while I was gone. The doctors insisted he needed rest, but it was hard to find peace knowing my stepmother had destroyed my mother's belongings. My stepmother always seemed resentful of the way our family spoke fondly of my mother. Last Thanksgiving was the first time my dad introduced his new girlfriend, soon to be my stepmother, to the family. Everyone was curious and eager to meet the woman who finally brought some joy back to his life after years of sadness. I remember sitting next to my dad with my stepmother on his other side, her hand resting in his. She looked a bit nervous, which was understandable for meeting the whole family for the first time. As we were preparing plates for dinner, my dad kept reassuring my stepmother. The conversation, as it did every year, naturally shifted to memories of my mom. No matter how much time passed, she was always present in our hearts during these gatherings. Aunt Linda turned to my stepmom and said, "You're just as beautiful as Mary was," referring to my mom. "My brother sure knows how to pick them," she added with a smile. Everyone murmured in agreement, but I noticed my stepmom's smile falter for a moment. She quickly composed herself and nodded politely. As dinner went on, stories about my mom began to flow. People reminisced about how she made the best pecan pie, how she'd sneak an extra slice to my cousin Jake, and how she had a way of making everyone feel special. My stepmom smiled and nodded along, but I could sense tension growing within her. The atmosphere truly shifted when Uncle Joe began to pray. We all bowed our heads, and as he always did, Uncle Joe led the blessing. "Lord, we thank you for this meal and the family gathered here today. We ask that you bless our food and our time together. We especially ask that you continue to bless Mary's soul. May she rest in peace and know she is missed dearly every day." The moment Uncle Joe mentioned my mom's name, I felt my stepmom tense up beside me, her hand, still holding mine under the table, gripped tighter. Even though her eyes were closed for the prayer, I could see how uneasy she felt. That's when I realized she was bitter about my mom, about how we still spoke about her, and how, no matter what she did, she would always be competing with a memory. When the prayer ended, she quickly let go of my hand and took a long sip of her wine as the family echoed amen. My dad, completely unaware, smiled at her and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, but I saw it. Later, during one of our hospital visits, my dad woke up more alert than he had been in days. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he needed to talk to Stephanie, my stepmom. I was worried about my dad and what might happen if we pushed my stepmother too hard, but my dad was determined. He wasn't the type to let things slide, and I knew that ignoring the problem would only make it worse for him. So, I agreed that we would confront her together. After my dad was discharged from the hospital, we decided to address the issue at home. The tension in the air was thick when we entered the house. My stepmother was casually watching TV, acting as if nothing had happened. Just seeing her made my blood boil, but I kept calm for my dad's sake. He told her they needed to talk, and when she noticed he was home, she tried to greet him with open arms. He pushed her away, leaving her stunned. She asked what was wrong, and he didn't hold back. "You know damn well what's wrong. You burned all of my wife's things," he said. For a moment, she paused, her face turning red. Then she tried to justify her actions, blaming him for still loving my mom. He told her that while he loved my mom, That didn't give her the right to destroy her belongings. She shot back, asking why it mattered if they were just things cluttering the house. The argument escalated as she screamed at him. I could see my dad getting angrier, so I motioned for him to sit down. I didn't want another trip to the hospital, but despite his weakness, he shook off my hand. This was all she had left of her mom. You threw it all away just to make space, he yelled. She rolled her eyes, dismissing his feelings, claiming he was being too dramatic. She insisted he couldn't live in the past forever and needed to move on. My dad replied that this wasn't about moving on. It was about respect. That's when I jumped in. Infuriated that she showed no remorse, she retorted that it was her house too, that she was now the wife, and if we had a problem, we could leave. She even claimed we should be grateful to her for getting rid of my mom's belongings, saying it would help us heal faster and stop reminding us of her death. My dad countered that he paid the mortgage and that his name was on the documents. He demanded she leave immediately. This seemed to be the last straw for him, especially since she hadn't even visited him in the hospital. When she refused to go, the argument intensified. My dad's face went pale again, and I urged him to sit on the couch. I told her to leave my dad alone, but she didn't care about the pain she was causing him. Once his color returned and his breathing steadied, I helped him to bed. The next morning was unnervingly quiet, with the tension from the night before hanging heavy in the air. My dad, still exhausted and drained, remained in bed. I could hear his slow breathing through the thin walls. I went downstairs, half expecting her to be gone, but there she was, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee like nothing had happened. She didn't even glance up as I walked in, her eyes glued to her phone, fingers flying across the screen. The phone call started soon after. First, my aunt called, confused and concerned. My stepmother had phoned her in the middle of the night, crying about how my dad and I were ganging up on her and treating her like an outsider in her own home. I tried to explain the real situation, but I quickly realized my stepmother had already twisted the story. Then, my dad's best friend called. He was worried, saying my stepmom had told him that my dad was losing control, unable to handle his grief, and was lashing out at her for no reason. She had made it sound like we were the ones at fault, that we were the problem. It became clear she was going to fight, and she wanted everyone to believe her side of the story. I glanced over at her, still sitting at the table, smirking as she typed away on her phone. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my coffee mug down on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. She finally looked up and calmly said she was making sure people knew the truth, claiming my dad and I weren't in the right state of mind to deal with things, so she was handling it. I laughed at the absurdity. She was serious. I told her she was lying to everyone, and I knew exactly what she was doing, painting us as the bad guys. She said she was just protecting herself and insisted that people needed to know what was really happening in our house. She went on a rant about how she'd never been welcomed in our home, that we treated her like a placeholder ever since my mom died. I fired back, reminding her that this was my dad's house and she was just bitter because she'd never measure up to my mom. I told her she needed to leave, or I'd call the police. She stood up slowly, eyes locked on mine. "We'll see about that," she said, brushing past me and leaving the house. As the door closed behind her, I knew this wasn't over. She was going to fight dirty, and if we didn't stop her, she'd take everything from us. After all the calls from family and friends, my dad's stress only got worse. He was barely sleeping, and it was taking a toll on his heart. The doctors warned us that if things didn't change, he might not make it. I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy him any longer. We needed to get her out of our lives, but she wasn't going to go quietly. That's when I realized we needed legal help. We found a lawyer who specialized in family law and began the divorce process. It was tough, and my stepmother fought us at every turn, but the harder she fought, the more her true nature came to light. She tried to play the victim and paint us as the bad guys, but the court saw through her lies. It was clear she had no remorse or empathy, just a selfish drive to get what she wanted, no matter who she hurt. The divorce was ugly. She dragged it out as long as possible, trying to drain us both financially and emotionally, but in the end, the court ruled in our favor, and she was forced to leave. We were finally free from her grip. After she left, it took time to heal. My dad's health slowly improved, though he was never quite the same. The stress had left him more fragile than before. We focused on rebuilding our lives, trying to find a new normal. It wasn't easy, and some days, the weight of everything we had been through felt overwhelming. But we had each other, and that was enough. We didn't talk much about my mom's things after that. The loss was too painful. Then one day, While going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a small envelope tucked away in a corner. It was addressed to me in my mom's handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, and tears filled my eyes as I read her words. She wrote about how much she loved me and how proud she was of the person I was becoming. At the end, she wrote, "No matter what happens, always remember that I'm with you in every memory, every moment. I'm there." I held the letter close to my chest, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. My mom might be gone, but she was still with me, in every memory, every moment, and no one could ever take that away. As time passed, the pain began to fade. My dad and I grew closer, knowing we couldn't change the past, but we could shape our future, and that's exactly what we did. We moved to a new house, a fresh start. On our first night there, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. My dad turned to me with a small smile and said, "We made it." I smiled back, "Yeah, we did." Through it all, I knew my mom was watching over us, and I knew she would be proud of the people we had become.
"Barry, what are you saying?" Cynthia stammered, shocked by her husband's terrible words. "Another woman? It can't be true. Look at me." She approached her husband, placing her hands on his shoulder, trying to make eye contact. Barry clearly resisted. He roughly pushed his wife away, stepping back towards the window and freezing in place. After a moment, Barry finally spoke. "Cynthia, believe me, I don't want to have a big confrontation right now. Let's handle this like adults and peacefully go our separate ways." "And pretend our marriage had never happened?" Tears flowed from Cynthia's eyes, her body shaking nervously and her head spinning. Perhaps her blood pressure had spiked, but she took a few deep breaths to calm down. "I don't want to end up in hospital because of my husband's cheating. No, I won't allow that to happen right now," she thought. "Oh my God, Cynthia, are you going to guilt trip me like this?" Barry glared at his wife. "Barry, when did you become so cruel and heartless?" Cynthia chuckled bitterly. "Have you forgotten all the good I did for our family in the past? And how I supported your health and morale after the accident? Don't you remember? Is that how you show your gratitude? We've been through so much together, Barry. Is any other woman worth sacrificing our happy years for? And what about the children? How can I explain to our sons that their father fell in love with another woman and left them?" "Cynthia!" Barry raised his voice, attempting to interrupt Cynthia's hysterics. "Why are you saying this? Do you want pity? Well, okay, you're a sweetheart, you're perfect and amazing, while your husband is the ultimate traitor and scumbag. Does that make you feel better? You can talk all you want. But let's face the truth. Our marriage has reached a deadlock. I believe you've noticed it too. Lately it's all about the kids. That's all we talk about during family dinners. I mean, I love the boys with all my heart, but it's just too much. Haven't I tried to get your attention, Barry? Didn't I try to have a conversation with you over a cup of tea? Didn't I make efforts to change things?" The woman's indignation knew no bounds. "And let me remind you, what was the answer you always gave? What did you always refer to? Work, of course, and important meetings and negotiations. And you always convinced me that there were no problems between us. How was I supposed to fix it, Barry? Tell me." "Cynthia, you're forcing me to speak honestly," the man said in an uncertain tone. Seeing his wife's silent nod, he continued with a hint of satisfaction. It seemed that humiliating the woman he once loved brought him great pleasure. "Well, you've asked for it. Do you know the difference between you and Mackenzie? Are you sure that you want to hear it? Fine, I'll answer. Youth and freshness. And let me clarify something right away. She's only 5 years younger than you, so it's not a huge difference. Yes, some people are naturally blessed with exquisite looks, but they're rare. Most of the time, attractiveness is acquired, which doesn't come without some external intervention. And no, I'm not talking about surgical operations, numerous Botox injections and the like. I don't approve of those. Everything should be done in moderation. But visiting a cosmetology salon, various skincare procedures, sports, massages, tanning, pleasant perfume, and sexy clothes, that's the foundation. Inner peace and good qualities as a human being are important, undoubtedly. But in addition to those, everything I just mentioned should also be present. And energy. You know, there are women who make you feel like a pathetic weakling when you're with them. Like you won't last. It's awful. You don't want to do anything for them. In a relationship with them, you don't invest at all because you realise it's a dead end. And then there are other women who give you incredible emotions and impressions just by being around them. With them, you want to soar. There's an intense energy and motivation. You constantly want to try your best, showcasing your finest masculine qualities. Barry's eyes shone brighter than usual as he made this revelation. To Cynthia's dismay, it was clear that he was indeed in love. "But you once felt something like that for me too, didn't you?" Cynthia barely managed to speak. It was incredibly difficult for her to listen to her husband's statements. Each word seemed to tear her heart into small pieces. I mean, all this novelty effect is unfortunately short-lived. If your mistress has gone through the same journey... "Those are stupid excuses," Barry replied, dissatisfied. "Instead of admitting your mistakes in our marriage, you completely blame others. With such thinking, life will be difficult for you." The man smiled, looking at his wristwatch. "Well, it no longer concerns me. You wanted an honest and open conversation and you got it. My conscience is clear now, and I have no intention of hiding anything anymore. So now, allow me to leave. Someone is waiting for me." "Is it so easy for you to go to her?" Cynthia seemed to still not believe that everything that was happening was not a silly prank but a cruel reality. "Will you really live there now?" "For now, yes. And then we'll see. You know, our divorce process could be prolonged due to having underage children and jointly acquired property. Of course, I would like everything to be resolved quickly and everyone to go their own way with a clear conscience. But I understand that it's not possible, alas. We need to be patient and wait. Oh, and by the way, I want to clarify that we will divide the property according to all the rules. I won't leave you and my children without anything, but I won't forget about myself either. I won't be heroic and start a new life with just a hypothetical penny in my pocket. That's not my story. You'll have to remember, Cynthia, what it's like to work for a living. It seems you've only gotten used to taking care of the house and children." "You never cease to amaze me, Barry," Cynthia dryly replied, gathering all her strength. "Good luck in your new adventure. Please don't come back here without a good reason. And the children? I will tell them everything myself. It's a pity, of course, that you didn't find the strength to do it yourself. But it's okay, I'll manage on my own. I got used to it. That's what I've always loved about you, Cynthia, your independence." The man laughed and, casting a slightly guilty glance at his still legal spouse, left the apartment. Closing the door behind Barry and watching him from the window, Cynthia made her way to the bedroom and, firmly closing the door behind her, lay down on the bed. Absolute silence reigned. Only the ticking of the clocks, given to them on their wedding day, disturbed it. Cynthia usually loved that sound. It was as if it calmed her and created a special coziness in the room. And the fact that the clocks were given on such a wonderful day was very touching, a memory for a lifetime. Amazingly, despite being quite simple, these clocks had worked flawlessly for all 13 years of their marriage. And the batteries, by the way, were rarely changed by the spouses. "These are some miracles, Barry," Cynthia said it once with a smile on her face. "It feels like they're eternal." The man gently embraced his wife. They are just as strong and resilient as our union. You'll see. They will last until our wedding anniversary." Now, remembering her husband's words, Cynthia felt desperation. Maybe I should get up from the bed, take the clocks off the wall, and throw them as far away as possible. What use do they have now except for reopening the wound in my heart? Eternal clocks, eternal feelings. It's only a fairy tale for trustful adults. The woman was about to carry out her plan when she suddenly hesitated. Will it change anything now? No. It's a very foolish act. Besides, I can't bring myself to do it. It hurts. Oh, how it hurts. I wish I could fall asleep right now, Cynthia thought to herself. Yes, I would like to sleep so deeply that I wouldn't hear or feel anything. Otherwise, it seems I won't be able to cope with this pain and longing. Maybe I should take a sleeping pill. Why not? The neurologist prescribed them for sleep problems when I was being examined. Maybe I should take much more than the recommended dose. No one will notice the loss, probably. Who needs me anyway? But at least I won't suffer. Life without Barry is not joyful for me. A tear rolling down the woman's cheek instantly brought her back to reality. But what about my boys? I can't leave them alone, can I? No, it's nonsense. My children are everything to me. I will endure everything for their happiness and well-being. And as for Barry, God will judge him. What else can I say? Thinking about the children, Cynthia looked at the clock. Okay, it's 2 o'clock. I need to get up from the bed immediately and start getting ready. With all these love experiences and sufferings, she had forgotten that it was time to pick up her younger son from daycare and her older son from school. Luckily, these institutions were nearby. She would make it. In just 10 minutes, Cynthia was already standing in the hallway in front of the mirror, trying to fix herself up. However, the reflection left much to be desired. She had looked happy and relaxed in the morning, but now tears filled her eyes as she gazed at her own image. Her face had a stare of silent sorrow, and her shoulders slumped. "What a beauty!" Cynthia laughed hysterically. "Well, I'll cover up my hair with a hat, and my swollen eyes with glasses. It's sunny outside today, so no one will be surprised." Finally, Cynthia left the apartment and, taking a deep breath of fresh air, walked briskly to pick up the children. She could have used the car, but she didn't want to risk it. In her current state of mood, driving was extremely dangerous. Driving requires attention and concentration, and walking might actually help her recover faster. "Mum, why didn't you drive today?" asked Mark, the eldest son, as they entered the apartment. "Come inside quickly," Cynthia urged the children. "Don't stand in the hallway." "Is Daddy home?" asked Johnny, the youngest son, with curiosity. "First, go and wash your hands and change your clothes," the woman sternly ordered, wanting to divert the children's attention. "We'll talk about everything at dinner." Reluctantly, the sons began to do their tasks, and Cynthia, entering the kitchen, froze in bewilderment. What am I going to feed the kids if I haven't cooked anything all day? The meat, which she had taken out to defrost early in the morning, waited obediently for its turn. The vegetables nearby were also a reminder of the grand plans for dinner. "No way," Cynthia said, pushing the groceries away. "I don't have time or strength for them right now. Maybe I'll have time to cook them tomorrow, but for tonight, well, we'll just have to make do with the bare minimum. What do I have in the pantry?" The woman opened the cupboard. "Okay, today we're having pasta. That's it." Quickly setting the table, Cynthia excitedly invited the children to dinner. Inside, she was literally filled with tension. She prayed for one thing. Please let the boys not start asking about their father right away. Please let me find a way to avoid it and not arouse unnecessary suspicion. "Mum?" Mark seemed determined. "You still haven't told me why we didn't take the car. Did it break down?" "Yes," Cynthia said with a smile. "That's right, son. It broke down. It happened unexpectedly, but it's okay. We'll get it fixed. And it's good for us to walk for a while. We'll be healthier. The weather outside is nice, warm enough and calm." "It's more comfortable with the car," the boy insisted. Today I got an A. Do you want me to tell you about it? Said another son. Yes, we'll listen attentively. The woman smiled again, but her chest ached with treachery. It was so bitter for her to look at her children, to listen to their fascinating and carefree stories, and to realise that everything would soon change. Soon, these boys, who held their father in such high regard, would be deprived of the opportunity to see him regularly. And, more importantly, how could she explain it to them? How could she avoid traumatising their fragile young minds? Maybe she should ask a psychologist. An expert could guide her on what to do in this situation. That was probably the most sensible thought she had all day. Mum, did you hear? Mark brought Cynthia out of her sad reflections. Huh? The woman struggled to return to reality. Of course I heard everything. Well done, my son. I'm proud of you. Mum, are you feeling any pain today? Johnny, a caring and sensitive boy, interjected. Me? Cynthia's heart raced faster than usual. Such a trivial question, yet it held so much warmth and care. Ah, if only she could discuss such matters with her children. No, I'm fine. It's true that my head hurts a little, but it's nothing to worry about, Johnny. It happens to adults often when the weather changes, or for some other reason. Are you finished? Now, go to your room and rest. Mark, do you have a lot of homework for tomorrow? No? Good. Then we'll do it later. With difficulty, Cynthia managed to get the children out of the kitchen. Then she carefully closed the door from the inside and started tidying up. Absolute silence surrounded her. She glanced at the wall clock and smiled sadly. Usually around this time, Barry would come home tired, sometimes overly busy and irritable, but so dear. Oh, how Cynthia loved that feeling when her husband, quietly and stealthily, using his keys to open the front door, would tiptoe into the kitchen and embrace her from behind while she stood by the stove. I missed you, the man used to whisper in her ear. And I missed you more, she always replied gently. In reality, Cynthia was always truly proud of her marriage. In this complex and unstable world, to meet the right person, create a loving union with them, overcome numerous obstacles along the way, and not lose the bright feelings. It's a great rarity in happiness. They met 15 years ago. Their meeting was quite ordinary. As it turned out, Barry and Cynthia had mutual friends who, without even realising it, facilitated their acquaintance. One warm July day, during a friend's birthday party, a true miracle happened. Barry, who was always shy, suddenly became bolder and more mature when he saw the smart and beautiful Cynthia. He was surprised, thinking that with common friends, he should have met her earlier. The well-mannered, kind and pleasant girl won his heart at first sight. Late in the evening, bidding farewell, he promised firmly that he would win her favour. She smiled and didn't take the cavalier's words seriously, and went home without suspecting how soon their lives would unfold. Barry began to court Cynthia in a gorgeous way, constantly organising surprises with his own hands, giving her lovely gifts, and even serenading under her window. The girl, amazed by such warm, sincere and caring attention, soon surrendered and allowed herself to finally become the happiest. Their friends couldn't hide their joy and pride in the couple. After all, not many are ready for such seriousness at such a young age. "Mum, I'm getting married!" Cynthia exclaimed happily, returning home after another date with her beloved. "Oh, my goodness!" The woman even trembled in place upon hearing this news. "Is it true, my dear?" "Of course, Mummy. I even have an engagement ring." The girl proudly extended her hand to her mother, showing her the gift from Barry. "Everything is real, as you can see. Yes, I know that according to tradition, everything is done differently. He was supposed to come to visit us, ask you and Dad for my hand and heart, and only then make an official proposal. But we couldn't wait. Today, celebrating the day of our acquaintance, our feelings stirred so much inside us that we decided it's not worth delaying. We need to get married, start a family, have children and be the happiest. That's commendable, of course, Cynthia, the woman said, embracing her daughter. You are young, in love with each other, not foolish, capable and hard-working. I think everything will work out for you. The only thing I can say from my own experience is that relationships always require effort. Well, I mean, having feelings is not enough, my dear. You need to grow together spiritually. Do you understand? Life throws us all kinds of adventures at times. We shouldn't be afraid of them. On the contrary, in difficult moments, people should come together, defy everything, and move forward. Mum, thank you, of course, for the advice. The girl gently began. I will definitely take it into account, but I think it won't be necessary for us. From the very beginning of our relationship, Barry and I agreed on everything. What, exactly, if it's not a secret? The mother looked at her daughter with tenderness. Well, we've sworn to discuss everything openly, not to hide any feelings, and to be open with each other. And of course, to be loyal and dedicated to our choice. Every day we must choose each other anew. Understand? We're going to surprise, delight and love each other. I think that in that case, everything will be fine. Of course it will, Cynthia. In a short time, the young couple tied the knot. Wanting to become independent and self-reliant as soon as possible, they rented a tiny apartment. And how do you see our family in the future, say 10 years from now? Cynthia looked affectionately at Barry. The man smiled. I can imagine how we solved all our financial problems and became completely free and independent. We have our own apartment, cosy and spacious. Just imagine, Cynthia, how great it will be, and of course, we will realise our potential and earn a decent living. I will take care of everything else, so you focus on family matters. And of course, we have children. I am sure we will be great parents. How wonderful that sounds, whispered the girl with tears of happiness in her eyes. I would very much like for everything to come true. Whether Barry was such a lucky man, whose dreams really have a way of coming true, or the right actions brought the desired results, but after a while, the couple's lives began to improve rapidly. Barry found a job at a promising company where his skills were finally appreciated. Cynthia also took a risk and left her old job, where success seemed unlikely. Her new position did not promise riches, of course, but it offered the potential for growth. And isn't that the most important thing? Around the same time, the couple obtained their own apartment, albeit through a mortgage, but it was their own. Oh, how happy they were when they first entered their new home, bright, spacious and so cosy. Despite the fact that there was almost nothing inside, and that proper investment was needed for quality repairs, all of this seemed like minor details in life, especially when they remembered where they had started their journey. A little later, Cynthia found out that she was pregnant. The long-awaited news brought Cynthia and Barry even closer together. They both smiled and thanked God for blessing them with a baby at just the right moment. Mark, a boy with blonde hair and big eyes, was born on time and completely changed his parents' lives. From the moment of his birth, he was a restless baby who constantly tested his parents' patience. However, even through the most challenging and sleepless nights, Barry and Cynthia found happiness. Mark, the result of their great and pure love, was truly a precious gift. When Mark turned 1 year old, a terrible event occurred. Barry got into an accident. That day would be etched into Cynthia's memory forever. She went with her son for a walk, feeling calm and relaxed. After all, what could go wrong? Mark's troubling cough had finally disappeared, and Cynthia could finally get a good night's sleep. During lunchtime, her husband had promised to come home and pick up some important documents. A meal prepared with love was waiting patiently on the stove for him. However, Everything changed instantly with one phone call. Cynthia received the shocking news that Barry had been in a serious accident and was in critical condition. At first she couldn't believe it, but she continued the conversation with the caller, trying to understand every word carefully. And then the realization came, so terrible and heavy. Overwhelmed with grief, Cynthia collapsed to the ground, feeling as if she had lost her mind. If it hadn't been for Mark, who was by her side, she didn't know what would have happened next. With the support of her parents, Cynthia managed to gather herself and go to the hospital, where she got answers to all her questions. The accident had nearly taken the life of her beloved husband. Unfortunately, the doctors couldn't provide any positive prognosis, simply shrugging their shoulders and referring to the will of God. They did their best to help him recover, but the future was uncertain. The injuries were severe and his spine was also affected. "I'm sorry for you. You know, it's a difficult situation," the doctor said sympathetically. "I understand," Cynthia whispered in a trembling voice, still struggling to comprehend the reality of the situation. "But I believe he will overcome this. He will regain consciousness soon. He'll come back to us. We have a family, a child. Barry will endure anything for us." "We will do everything we can, I promise. But his spine has been injured, and it is likely to have an impact." No, he will walk. Don't doubt it. Barry is a strong man. He will manage, you'll see." The doctors were amazed by this fragile woman. Her faith in the best, immense love, care and positive attitude couldn't leave anyone indifferent. Oh, if everyone had such strong support, how wonderful it would be. Fortunately, Barry was soon able to come to his senses and start full treatment. It required great effort, time and resources for the man to somewhat return to his previous life. It was painful, scary, and sometimes so difficult that he wanted to give up. But Cynthia's support didn't allow him to do so. Perhaps his wife acted as a guardian angel for him during that period. That's when Barry promised himself that he would remember what Cynthia did for him for the rest of his life. How could he forget such a thing? No, he definitely made the right choice once. And when Cynthia learned about her second pregnancy, unexpected but still pleasant and joyful, she realized that everything in this world happens for a reason. By that time, Mark had grown up and needed the company of a little brother or sister, and so another little boy, who looked very much like Barry, came into the world. "Oh God, Barry, what happiness!" Cynthia whispered happily, putting her son in the crib. "We have 2 adorable children now. Mark is already 5 years old, and Johnny is only a month old. It feels like we have always been there for each other. Right? How beautifully everything has turned out in our lives." "And this is just the beginning, Cynthia. Just the beginning." After washing the last cup, Cynthia turned off the water and sighed heavily. "I should stop recalling the past," the woman said aloud. "If I keep remembering our family life, I won't make it until morning. Perhaps a double dose of sedatives won't hurt today." After putting the children to bed and preparing for rest, Cynthia, with tired legs, made her way to the bedroom, and barely laying her head on the pillow, fell into a deep sleep. Probably fatigue and tension, combined with the sedatives, did their job. Mum, are you asleep?" Mark shook Cynthia's shoulders in alarm. "What?" The woman barely came to her senses. Her head was pounding with tremendous force, and everything around her was blurry. She didn't feel good. "Why did you wake up so early?" "Isn't it time to get ready for school?" the boy said skeptically and pointed at the clock. "It might be late." "Did we oversleep?" Cynthia decisively got up from the bed, but feeling dizzy, she returned to her previous position. "Mum, is something hurting you?" Mark seemed to notice every little detail. No, everything is fine. Cynthia smiled weakly, and realizing that she couldn't handle everything on her own today, she decided to ask for help. Hand me the phone, please. I want to invite your grandma over. Half an hour later, the frightened and worried woman arrived to help her daughter. Seeing her condition, she seemed to understand what had happened, but she didn't want to pry. First, she needed to help with her grandchildren. After preparing a quick breakfast, feeding and getting the boys ready, the grandmother practically ran them to the educational institution, and then, feeling considerably calmer, returned to her daughter. Come on, Cynthia. Tell me what happened. Sitting on the bed, she asked gently, Did you check your blood pressure? You look pale. If your head is spinning, maybe it's a seizure, huh? You had a hard time with headaches, my dear. And I always told you to seek treatment, to continue the examination, and not to neglect your health. But have you listened to me? You always think about others, never about yourself. I got nervous, apparently, Cynthia whispered in response. I took a large dose of sedatives at night. Maybe it has an effect like this. I don't know, Mum. Thank you for coming. You saved me. If it weren't for you... Cynthia's voice trembled, and unexpectedly for herself, she burst into tears. Honey, the woman tried to keep calm. First, let's measure your blood pressure. You'll take a pill if needed, and then we'll talk about everything. All right? Health comes first, don't forget. After about an hour, when the blood pressure had slightly subsided and Cynthia felt much better, the conversation about the important matter resumed. Now, let's get back to the reason for your tears, my dear. The woman sighed heavily. Did you have a fight? Is that why you're so upset? Darling, you're wasting your energy on nonsense. In married life, all sorts of things happen. Have you forgotten? He has another woman, Cynthia said dryly, lowering her eyes. What? The woman nervously laughed. Our Barry has another woman? That can't happen, Cynthia. I couldn't believe it at first either. Cynthia sadly smiled. But yesterday he confessed everything to me. Wow! How long have they been dating? I don't know, Mum. I didn't ask. Cynthia laughed bitterly. It doesn't really matter how long they've been together. What matters is how happy and in love he looks. Apparently it's a big hit. Mum, can I be honest? I'm in so much pain. I don't know how to go on. I was thinking yesterday about... Stop that right now, her mother sternly ordered, without even listening to her daughter. I never want to hear such terrible things from you again. Betrayal of a loved one is a real tragedy, no doubt, especially when it happens completely unexpectedly. To be honest, I couldn't even imagine such a thing. Believe me, I'm as shocked as you are. But daughter, my darling, you can't give up. You can't give up. Do you hear me? You have someone to hold on to. And Barry, we don't know what pushed him into this sinful affair. Maybe he couldn't control himself and gave in to temptation. Or maybe he had some kind of crisis. Don't forget what he went through in the past. He barely made it out. Then Johnny was born. One thing after another, you know, it all affects everything. It's so stressful. No, I'm not justifying cheating and betrayal. I find it repulsive too. I'm just trying to make a clear assessment of the situation. Consider different options and find a reason. To find a reason, Cynthia grinned. You won't believe this. I've been doing that for 24 hours. I'm going over everything in my head, remembering our family life, trying to figure out what I did wrong. Tears welled up in Cynthia's eyes. That's what makes it so hard. I felt with every fibre of my being that I was needed, important and loved. It seemed that after 13 years of marriage, having given birth to 2 children, we were inseparable. It seemed that our marriage was unbreakable. It turns out it isn't. Have you had any problems lately? Or didn't you notice anything at all? Did everything happen so suddenly? That's just it, Mum. We haven't had any obvious problems. At least I didn't notice any. Yes, the last few years of our lives have been difficult. You make a good point about the terrible accident and the birth of our second child. Yes, Barry has had a difficult time. For a long time, he snapped at me and wanted to give up, tired of the grueling process of recovery. But then he calmed down and apologised. They often say that women feel everything and notice everything. And I, so busy with the kids and the house, missed that moment. Can you imagine? Barry himself asked me not to go to work anymore, and now he scolded me for that. Me, the woman who put so much effort, energy and love into him, neglecting her health. Is that fair, huh? And now I'm thinking, when he used to come home tired and dissatisfied, citing work and some failures in his professional sphere, was the real reason in her? I guess so. The mother agreed. And I, a fool, tried to talk, worried about my husband's moral state. I tried to find out the cause and somehow help, but it was all in vain. I wonder why he didn't leave right away. Did he feel sorry for us? Or was he unsure of his choice? Oh, Mum, how am I going to get through this? How am I supposed to deal with the kids alone? How do I help them in this situation? I don't understand anything. My head is spinning. Cynthia, honey, the woman said, literally feeling her daughter's state and barely restraining herself from crying with her. First, you need to calm down. Try to shut off your emotions and think about the essentials. Plan for what you need to do in the near future. It will make things easier, believe me. Since Barry has already left the house taking some of his things, let him do it. There's no need for unnecessary fussing. Before that, let him come to the kids. Explain his position to them. There's nothing for you to blame yourself for. You are the son's parents, first and foremost. You shouldn't forget that. Then, let him file for divorce, since he's made up his mind, and then it'll be easier. Believe me, when this process starts slowly, some clarity will come. You know, there's nothing worse than uncertainty in life. So, you'll grieve, get hurt, and calm down. At least you'll know the truth, and that's easier. Divide the property according to all the rules. He won't leave you penniless. That's a good thing too. If you need any help, your father and I are here for you, Cynthia. Don't worry about him alone. The most important thing is to regain your composure, become independent, and start looking for a job. Remember how much you enjoyed working for your company, and you always loved your profession, until family life took over. Now is the time to remember all of that. I'm so scared, Mum. It feels like the ground has been pulled out from under me, like my heart has been ripped out of my chest, like my past life has been erased and no new one has been provided. And what do you want, dear? It's like a stepping out of your comfort zone in some way. And that's always painful, difficult and stressful. How could it be otherwise? But you're young and strong. You'll endure. You'll overcome. And I believe in you. And as for Barry, God is his judge. If he didn't appreciate such a good woman by his side, if he betrayed and stumbled, let him go his own way. Many men do that, unfortunately. They drain the life out of their wives, use her help and support to stand on their feet, and then start looking elsewhere. As if they forget who they were from the very beginning. Who should be idolized and loved until the end of their lives? Foolish, isn't it? They think their new girlfriend will provide them with constant, unforgettable emotions and won't ask for anything in return. I've seen many cases like that in my life, but in the end, most of them are disappointed with their choice they start to yearn and beg to come back to their wives. And then it's up to the woman to decide. What would you do, Cynthia? The woman looked at her daughter attentively. Me? Cynthia thought for a moment. I would forgive him, Mum, because I love him very much, and I can't imagine my life without him. A couple of months passed. Well, congratulations on officially becoming a free woman, Barry said with a smile when he finally got divorced. I hope you don't hold a grudge against me. God knows when we first met I was the happiest man in the world, and we had many good and wonderful moments during our marriage. I remember everything. And I congratulate you, Cynthia abruptly interrupted, no longer able to listen to the sweet speeches of her former spouse. Parting from her beloved man was extremely painful for the woman. While she managed to get through the days by keeping herself busy with additional responsibilities to avoid thinking about Barry, but at night she let her emotions run free, crying a lot and carefully analysing the events. At first, Cynthia tried to cope with the pain of loss on her own, but after realising how difficult it was for her, she sought professional help. She also sought guidance on how to support her children through their parents' divorce and make their situation easier. With the support of her mother and father, Cynthia gradually regained her composure and started looking for a job. Barry, of course, provided financial assistance, but he did so very reluctantly. Surprisingly, perhaps his new partner required a significant investment in herself. Or maybe the man was facing difficulties in his professional life again. No one knew the truth. Cynthia, of course, did not hinder communication between her sons and their father. On the contrary, she was sincerely happy when the children became a little happier and spent more joyful time with their close and dear man. Well, how was the interview? Cynthia's mother asked her as soon as she returned home. Oh, it went beautifully, Mum. Can you believe it? They hired me. I don't know if it was my resume and past achievements that impressed them, or if the director was just understanding, or if it was simply a good day, but they hired me. What good news, the mother smiled. My congratulations, life is getting better, isn't it? If only one job could make life better. Cynthia became sad again. Her heart still ached with terrible pain. Time, daughter. Everything takes its time. Trust me. Cynthia, aren't you going home yet? A colleague asked in surprise. It's already the end of the day. Yes, I know. The woman smiled slightly. I just decided to stay a little longer today. I need to double-check some documents. You know, things have been a mess lately. I'm amazed by your attentiveness and responsibility. The colleague softly responded. Honestly, I'm overjoyed that our company gained such a valuable employee 5 years ago. You have a lot of energy and diligence. I hope you know that. But please don't stay too long. After all, the kids are waiting at home, and you need to rest. Thank you for your kind words. Cynthia was very pleased to hear such things said to her. Over the years, she had never once regretted joining this company. It had its difficult moments, of course, and sometimes felt incomprehensible, but overall, it was definitely worth it. After double-checking the last document and placing it in the folder, the woman smiled and breathed a sigh of relief. She straightened her shoulders and did a little exercise for her stiff back, a result of her sedentary lifestyle. She then turned off her laptop, switched off the light, gathered her belongings and stepped outside. The weather was simply wonderful, and her mood noticeably improved. Cynthia! Well, you're finally free. A familiar voice suddenly sounded nearby. The voice of someone she couldn't easily forget. It's me. Didn't you recognise me? Barry, Cynthia whispered, struggling to look at her former spouse. They hadn't seen each other for several years, ever since the man decided to entirely change his life and move to another city. What are you doing here? Why? I was looking for a chance to meet with you, Barry began awkwardly, and actually, yes, I came back to my hometown. Our climate suits me better, and, well, the man approached his former wife, his warm breath reaching her, and the scent, a scent she thought she had forgotten. Cynthia covered her eyes, desperately wishing to return to reality. "What do you think you're doing?" Cynthia asked sternly. "Did you have a fight with your beloved and decide to come running back? Did you think you could just disappear like that and then announce your presence in my life again? Do you think I've been waiting for you all this time?" "Cynthia, I was a fool," Barry said, looking straight into his former spouse's eyes. "I made the wrong choices in my life. I left and betrayed the most important people in the world. I don't know what came over me. It was like I was blindly driving. Can you hear me? I realized my mistake just in time. I know it's incredibly difficult to forgive. I understand that the hurt and pain will linger for a long time. But please, give me a chance to make things right. There's so much to try to compromise on. We've been through so much together. We have children after all. I deeply regret leaving my boys without a father's attention and involvement. I want to come back. I want to earn your trust again. Yes, I stumbled. You saved me once before. You were almost like my guardian angel. Save me again, please. Give me a helping hand. I really need you. I love you, and—" "That's enough," Cynthia whispered. "Barry, that's enough. I can't listen to this. It hurts. Do you hear me? Just stop, for God's sake, and go away. Please, go away." "You won't even give me a chance to make amends?" Barry exclaimed, bewildered. "Make amends? Do you really think, Barry, that life is so simple? Do you want to hear the truth? I loved you, and I loved you with sincere and pure love. I believed in you and our family until the very end. I even forgot about myself at times, giving everything I had to you. I thought it was right, logical, and natural. I'm a wife and a mother. What else could I be? But there was one thing I didn't consider then. Excessive love and care from a woman can sometimes work against her, making her dependent and vulnerable. It would be great if her husband realized this and never betrayed her. On the contrary, he changes the situation, lightens her load, helps her reintegrate into society, and is always there for her, loving and appreciating her. In our case, you did something terrible. You betrayed me. It was so cruel and disgusting. You completely disregarded our family, disregarded the happy years we had together, and put your own comfort and pleasure above all else. Do you remember how you left? How did you savour every word that hurt me so deeply? How you repeatedly humiliated me by telling me colourful stories about your feelings for another woman, comparing and devaluing me? And what about the children? Have you ever thought about how hard it has been for them all this time? Yes, people make mistakes. But not all mistakes, Barry, can be undone. Once upon a time, I believed that I would forgive you. Honestly, every night before going to bed, I prayed for reconciliation and for my husband to return to our family. Why? Because I loved you and couldn't imagine life without you. And now, when it seems like I have achieved what I wanted, when you are standing here next to me, tearfully asking for forgiveness, I know I can't. This betrayal has wounded my soul so deeply that it's irreparable. So, Barry, don't come here anymore. Don't seek a meeting. Your guardian angel is gone forever. Now, you have to deal with everything on your own. Having said that, Cynthia turned and walked away, her head held proudly high. She felt avenged. When Emily was very young, she had a deep love for fairy tales. Each time she believed that these enchanting stories could become a reality in her own life. However, it turned out that dreams can come true in unexpected and frightening ways. First, her mother passed away, leaving young Emily feeling devastated. At that time, Emily couldn't accept the fact that her mother would no longer enter their home, prepare delicious breakfasts, or engage in playful pillow fights in their bed. The girl convinced herself that everyone around her was pretending, hiding the truth that her mother had merely fallen under the spell of an evil sorceress and was now trapped in a deep slumber within a fairy tale dream. Desperate for her mother's return, Emily pleaded with her father to wake her up. However, all her father could do was weep, and a year later, another woman entered their lives, Annabelle. "This is Annabelle," Emily's dad explained. "She will be your new mum." "No," Emily firmly replied, stepping back from the fake smile of her new woman. "I don't need a new mum." "Of course you do," her father insisted, grabbing Emily and pulling her closer. "Annabelle knows how to take care of kids. She's a teacher. I'm sure you two will become friends." "No way," Emily declared, resisting her father's grip. "We don't need her." For the first time in her life, Emily received a spanking from her father. Although it wasn't physically painful, it was deeply hurtful, and she spent the rest of the day alone in her room shedding tears. When hunger finally drove her out of her hiding place, Annabelle informed her that she would only receive food if she referred to her as mother. That evening, Emily went to bed hungry, sobbing uncontrollably. Contrary to her hopes, her father did not remove the wicked stepmother from their lives. In fact, she gradually became the dominant figure in their household. Their lives began to resemble the fairy tales of stepmothers and unfortunate stepdaughters, even to the extent that Emily's father fell ill. He suffered for a long time, his illness consuming him from within. 12-year-old Emily couldn't bear to see her father in that state, emaciated, pale, with a drip in his arm. "I won't live much longer," her father admitted one day, in a simple and matter-of-fact manner. "You see, my first wife is calling me to her. I thought I could cope, I could live without her, but it didn't work. I'm sorry, Annabelle, I guess I'm a one-woman man. Go on living, but I beg you, don't leave Emily." "I love you, of course I won't," the new wife assured him, holding his hand. But Emily sensed that it was all a lie. After her father's passing, Emily discovered that he had left all his money to her. Annabelle became her legal guardian. At first, she took the girl's funds with a cautious eye, and then, feeling complete impunity, she became increasingly reckless. Less than 6 months later, the widow found herself a new husband, a young, audacious man with the physique of a fitness trainer. Emily started isolating herself more and more in her room, avoiding hearing or seeing them. She would often wander around the city aimlessly. Although she excelled academically and maintained a tidy appearance, she never participated in any class activities. Most people assumed she was just naturally reserved, so no one questioned her further. However, the truth was that Emily had no money at all, not even an allowance. The girl patiently waited for the day when she could inherit her father's money and escape from the house that no longer felt like her own. Things took a turn for the worse when the stepmother suddenly began suspecting that her young husband was showing excessive attention to her young stepdaughter. She constantly monitored both of them, causing a frequent confrontation. On one occasion, she even threw a hot frying pan at Emily, who managed to shield herself with her hand, resulting in a burn mark. Emily's life turned into a nightmare. She would forever remember that day when her enraged stepmother grabbed her and threatened to throw her off the balcony from the 7th floor. Looking into the mad woman's burning, deranged eyes, Emily screamed and screamed until her stepmother's husband rushed out and restrained his wife. Emily gasped for air, rubbing her throat with her hands, but only hoarse sounds emerged. Little did she know that her voice had completely disappeared. That evening, huddled under her blanket, Emily overheard snippets of conversation through the wall. "What have you done?" her husband yelled. "Now she'll definitely go to the police and spill everything. You'll end up in jail, you fool, and then goodbye to your cushy life with orphan money. How stupid can you be to mess things up like this?" "That won't happen," the stepmother declared suddenly. "I'll take care of everything." "What else are you up to?" shouted the obviously frightened man. "Mind you, I didn't sign up for anything like that." "I know, because you're a coward," replied the stepmother coldly. "I'll take her out of sight, to my grandmother's village, to get some fresh air. And there, the places are remote, all sorts of people meet. Again, the river is deep near. Anything can happen." "I didn't hear that," said the man. Emily did not listen further. Her ears were noisy. Her heart was beating like crazy. What to do? Go to the police? Just like that? Without a voice? She wouldn't even be able to explain what happened. Well, she will write a statement, and stepmother will say that this is all a lie, written to incriminate an honest woman. But she's going to take her to the middle of nowhere and drown her there. Something must be done. In the morning, the stepmother ordered Emily to pack. The girl's voice never came back, so she couldn't even call for help. Emily was getting more and more scared by the minute. "I'll run away on the road," she decided to herself. Her stepmother drove her out of town, and they drove for a long time through completely unfamiliar places. Emily had never been in these parts. Besides, there were few settlements along the way, only forests replaced by fields. The girl estimated that they had travelled for about 5 hours. The road had long ago become a country road, and then it dived into a dense thicket. Trees approached her from both sides, bending down, as if looking at her. Who decided to disturb their peace? Emily felt an unbearable urge to go to the restroom, and she mooed and tried to tell her stepmother. At first, the woman didn't pay attention to her, but then, realizing that the damned girl could ruin her seat, she stopped and forcibly dragged Emily out of the car. "Come on, what are you waiting for? There's no one here." She pointed the girl directly at the road, but she shook her head and nodded at the thick bushes. "Oh, how shy we are," said her stepmother with a sneer. "Okay, get into the bushes if you like, and I'm here in the car. Let's hurry up." Emily, making sure that the stepmother was waiting for her right on the road, climbed into the bushes. Here it is, a chance, flashed a crazy thought, and the girl ran as fast as she could, right into the forest wilderness, tearing like a hunted deer between branches, bushes and trees. "You little brat!" screamed the stepmother, rushing after her. But time had been lost, and Emily had gotten a little head start. In addition, terror gave her speed, and she ran. The stepmother's voice became quieter and quieter, remained somewhere behind, and then the strength left her, and Emily collapsed face down in the soft moss. That's what saved her. By some miracle, she ran into the very centre of the swamp without falling into the mire by the islets that were firmly on the surface. A driftwood that had been accidentally knocked down on the run went to the bottom, and by the time the panting stepmother ran out to the place, the mire had just closed over her with a loud slurping sound. The stepmother gazed at the chain of footprints left by the fugitive, then shifted her gaze to the spot where something had gone underneath. Did she really drown herself? Good riddance to you, you little wretch. She spat into the grass, shivered angrily, and walked back towards the car. Emily didn't hear her words. She lost consciousness. She woke up from the fact that lying down was wet. The girl opened her eyes and almost screamed with horror. The mossy grass tubercle on which she was lying was slowly going down into the mire. Emily froze, afraid to move, and looked around. The lessons had taught her to grab onto a branch or lean on a stick, but there was neither here. She tried to crawl away. As it turned out, in vain, because she immediately fell into the mire. Emily moaned, floundering and kicking up the viscous mud with her hands. Suddenly, it seemed to her that some shadow on the other side of the swamp rushed towards her and crawled closer. 2 yellow eyes flashed. "A wolf!" flashed through the girl's mind. She became so frightened that she stopped waving her arms and prepared to drown. But the shaggy shadow, moving purposefully and breathing noisily, was already near. Could it be a dog, after all? Emily hesitated. There was no time to ponder, and she clutched at the animal's fur. Feeling that the swamp was letting go, Emily wrapped her arms around her 4-legged helper's neck and began to crawl out of the mire. Both were panting from exertion, but their legs were already free. The girl released her hands, catching her breath. However, her saviour, whoever he was, growled and grasped her arm. Not painfully, but in a way that made her feel his fangs. Emily somehow understood what was expected of her and crawled after him, attempting to replicate the exact path. Occasionally, the beast glanced back as if checking if she was still there. The journey through the swamp seemed endless, and Emily could hardly believe it when she managed to grab hold of a branch and pull herself onto dry ground. She rolled onto her back and closed her eyes. Then she felt a rough tongue on her cheeks. Well, now he will eat me, with some indifference, thought the girl. She felt so sad that she did not want to live or move at all. And yet she raised her head and looked into the eyes of the beast. Somewhere she had heard or read that animals could not bear a direct human gaze. Apparently this beast had not read about the fact, for it looked at her directly and even, it seemed, reproachfully. And then he turned and went into the thicket, looking around. At first Emily didn't understand his intentions and felt a flicker of joy. Perhaps he had been satiated or found her unappetizing. There was a chance that the beast would leave and she could get up and go. But the beast, noticing that the girl remained still, growled irritably and returned. Emily flinched, and it seized her wet jacket's edges, dragging her behind him. Who cares? She thought. I'll follow him. Maybe he really does know the way to the humans, and isn't trying to lead me into his lair. and have me as canned food there at all. Her doubts vanished when, after half an hour of relentless struggle through the branches, they arrived at a clearing in the middle of the forest. There stood a hut that looked like it belonged to Hansel and Gretel, or so Emily thought. Even in critical situations, her love for fairy tales made itself known. The beast approached the dwelling and emitted a hoarse sound resembling a growl.
"Wolfie, is that you?"
came a voice from the hut.
"Are you hungry, wanderer?"
The door swung open, revealing a huge man in a camouflage suit. At least, that's how he appeared to the frightened girl. A woodsman or a hunter? Emily's thoughts scattered like frightened squirrels.
"Who have you brought?"
the bewildered man asked, scanning the trembling Emily, clearly shivering from the cold and fear.
"Who are you?"
He was indeed a little under 2 meters tall, so she could only look up at him, with her head raised. Emily pointed to her mouth and shook her head.
"Are you mute?"
the man exclaimed. Emily burst into tears, having already experienced more than enough shocks for one day.
"Enough with the dampness, you're completely soaked," grumbled the man. "Come inside the hut. I have the dry clothes on the bench. Get out of those rags and change into them, and I'll take care of this shaggy dog."
Trembling, Emily entered the warm hut, filled with the scent of herbs. She removed her wet clothes, found a warm shirt, wrapped it around herself like a dress and buttoned it up. The door creaked, and the man picked Emily's wet clothes up and carried her outside, giving another instruction.
"Take the warm felt boots near the furnace. Don't shake like that. I don't eat little ones like you."
Indeed, there was a small furnace in the hut that emitted enough heat. Emily found the felt boots and put them on, relishing the blissful warmth. Glancing out the window, she saw the man stroking her saviour and then throwing something into its bowl. From the depths of her heart, the girl hoped it wasn't the stew of some other lost girls after all. Surprisingly, as she warmed up, her fear dissipated. It seemed that she had reached the limit of fear, and now indifference had taken its place. But what else could happen? Well, they would think about it later, for now she was starving. After some thought, Emily went to the table and noticed a newspaper with a crossword puzzle and a pencil next to it. It seemed that the local hermit still had some connection with the outside world, since he was interested in the news. She took the pencil and wrote in the margins of the newspaper, "My name is Emily. I lost my voice because of my stepmother. She wanted to kill me." After some more thought, Emily added, "I'm starving." Taking the newspaper, the girl went outside. Both the man and the animal looked back at the creaking door.
"Well, what have you got there?"
The man looked at the paper, read it, and whistled in surprise.
"Wolfie, look at that. There's a whole thriller here. You're not making it up?"
This was now referring to Emily. She shook her head.
"Well, Wolfie, should we believe it?"
The man turned to the animal. The animal made a short sound, as if confirming.
"All right. First, we need to feed her and give her a bath,"
said the man. As if remembering something, he added,
"Why weren't you scared of Wolfie? You thought he was a dog, right?"
Emily nodded again.
"But he is a wolf," the man said with a snort. "I rescued him from a trap when he was a wolf cub. So now we live like 2 lonely wolves. My name is Hugh, and I'm a kind of forester."
Emily nodded her head.
"Okay, we've met."
Hugh added food to Wolfie's bowl and nodded to Emily.
"Come on, I'll feed you what God sent. The chowder is still warm, probably."
The pleased girl followed him into the hut. Hugh took out a pot, poured the stew into 2 large bowls, and put a spoon and a couple of slices of bread.
"Eat,"
he pointed to Emily's bowl.
"Don't be afraid. There's hare meat in there. We don't eat girls. They give me an ulcer," he said, apparently pleased with his own joke.
Emily, hesitating, smiled too
and grasped the spoon. The stew turned out to be mind-bogglingly delicious. Or was it that she was so hungry and scared that she could eat a whole pot? Eating the stew with bread, she glanced stealthily at Hugh's face. And he's not so old, she thought, not like an elderly man. Just the beard adds age. Perhaps he's the same age as my father. Tears came to her eyes as she thought of her father, and she sobbed. "Hey, don't make everything wet in here." The owner of the hut raised his voice. "I can't stand these feminine tears." Emily, frightened by his displeasure, began eating silently again. The tears dried on their own. What kind of scoundrel raises a hand against a child? Hugh pondered. And why didn't Daddy intervene? Emily looked up at him and sighed. Then she shook her head and crossed her arms over her chest. What? No Mummy or Daddy? The woodsman was horrified. Oh, you poor thing. I could have had a daughter your age if only... He waved his hand and began to eat. Emily finished every last drop, wiped her plate with a crust of bread, and looked questioningly at Hugh. What's next? He understood correctly. You're going to wash yourself now. The basin is outside and there's hot water in the buckets. I'll bring everything out. Just be careful. Emily rolled up the sleeve of her shirt, and Hugh saw the burn mark. Who did that to you? Hugh gasped. Could it be your stepmother? Emily nodded. Hugh's face darkened. He muttered something under his breath. Emily only understood one sentence. We'll figure it out. Go and wash yourself. Wolfie will look after you, the woodsman ordered. Having received a bucket of hot water, a towel, soap, and huge shorts, on which the forester had pulled the elastic band, so that at least in the waist they did not fall down, Emily went to wash. Behind the house there was a basin and a tub of rainwater. She washed away not only the dirt, but also the fears and tensions of the past years. Wolfie's face peeked out from behind the house, and it seemed to her that the wolf was smiling. With an independent demeanour, he approached and lay down, guarding her. Emily rubbed her body with renewed effort, then dried herself, dressed, and sat down next to her guardian. She affectionately stroked his dry fur and mumbled something in gratitude. Now that she had eaten and washed, she felt safer than she had in her former home. Are you okay? Finished with the water treatments? Hugh asked from around the corner. Instead of Emily answering, Wolfie raised his head and growled in affirmation. The forester, satisfied that his uninvited guest was dressed and even managed to wash her clothes from the wet pile, hung it up to dry, hummed, and sat down a little further away. What am I to do with you, eh? He asked, not so much to Emily as to himself. Do you have any relatives? The girl shook her head negatively. That's bad. The man reflected. Ideally, I should return you to the city and sue your stepmother. Emily looked at him with frightened eyes. But I don't believe in our supposedly fairest justice system in the world. Hugh shrugged his shoulders. Besides, while they sort things out, you'll be put in an orphanage. I bet it's not a good place. Emily waited anxiously for a decision. There's also no sense in you staying with me, continued Hugh. I'm not good for a young lady to live with. An old hermit. It's not right. And I'm used to being alone. Emily's lips trembled. It seemed to her that now Hugh would suggest that the orphanage would be the best solution for her. Oh, please stop. We agreed not to breed dampness. The forester frowned, and Wolfie looked at her reproachfully. I said I'll think of something. He clearly didn't know how to handle Emily. Wolfie, having settled down on the grass, watched with obvious irony as his master, having sent the girl to the hut, walked in circles, grumbling to himself under his nose something. I can't kick her out. I can't go anywhere. Hugh reasoned, turning to Wolfie. I can't turn her in to the police. Staying here isn't an option for her either, and I'm not a babysitter. There's only one thing left. he said, shining with determination. "I'll take her to Teresa. She's a sorceress. Maybe she'll help her get her voice back. And don't look at me like that," he said to Wolfie, though he remained silent. "I know that her character is not sugar, but at least she's a woman." Wolfie raised one ear and covered his nose with his paw, seemingly laughing. "Go ahead and giggle at me," Hugh threatened him with his finger. "By the way, this is your responsibility. You're the one who brought the girl from the swamp here." Wolfie looked at him reproachfully as if saying, "Would you have left the child there?" "All right. Don't squint. So, we decided to go to Teresa's." Emily was sitting on the bench, looking at the interior decoration of the hut. But what kind of decoration was there? A furnace, a bench, a table, a chest, a window without a curtain. On the walls hung brooms of different herbs, and various tools needed in the household. That's all. It was obvious that the owner lived alone, and here she had fallen on his head. "He'll kick me out or give me back to my stepmother," Emily sadly thought. These thoughts made her feel chilly, and she wrapped herself more tightly in her shirt. For some reason, she was no longer afraid of this wild-looking man. She felt that men like him would never hurt. That's what her daddy was like. Courageous, strong, kind. Emily dropped her face on her hands folded on the table and burst into tears. The girl did not hear how Hugh came into the room and sat down next to her. He gently stroked her back with his broad palm. "Don't cry, baby. Life is such that you can't even cry enough." Emily listened quietly as the forester spoke. "Do you like fairy tales?" he asked, and she saw a smile on his face. Emily lifted her head and nodded. "Then you must know some fairy tales about witches." Emily opened her eyes even wider, but nodded again. "I have an acquaintance who lives nearby, in a village. She is the only one left in that village," Hugh continued. "Her name is Teresa. She is a skilled healer, and people come to her from miles away. She is a very moral person. She can cure anyone for free, but she can refuse to cure anyone for a large sum of money. I'm sure she can cure your inability to speak." Emily listened attentively, feeling like she was in a fairy tale. However, she was afraid to go to a strange woman, in case she turned out to be angry like her stepmother, and besides she was starting to get used to Hugh. "We will go and visit her," Hugh continued. "She cured me as well, when I thought I would never recover. Now I help her in any way I can. I fix things in her house and gather firewood. Believe me, Emily, there is a chance that you will be able to speak again." Emily nodded uncertainly. "That's settled," Hugh rejoiced. "You can sit here and solve this crossword puzzle while I gather some gifts for Teresa. It's not appropriate to go empty-handed when asking for help." He left the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. Emily couldn't sit still. The future frightened her. She looked around and found a broom and began to sweep the floor. Then she wiped the window with a rag and dusted it. Unable to think of anything else to do, she lay down on the bench and fell asleep. "Were you tired?" Hugh's voice woke her up. Emily opened her eyes and smiled shyly. He didn't seem as scary to her anymore. Her stepmother, despite her false kindness, turned out to be a real witch, and this big man living in the forest with a tame wolf didn't harm her. He fed her and even promised to help her heal. "I'm impressed at how tidy everything here is." Hugh looked around. "Thank you. Sorry, but I can't just leave you here. It's not right. And what kind of caretaker would I be? Worthless." Emily nodded shyly. He was saying the right things, but the girl had already experienced enough fear, and she wasn't sure what to expect next. "Don't worry," Hugh encouraged her. "If you are rested, it's time to hit the road. Here, take this bundle of presents." Hugh handed her a wicker tub of berries. Teresa has a sweet temperament and likes to be appeased. It will help. In his backpack, he packed all sorts of things, apparently also as a gift for the strange Teresa. Then he took Emily by the hand and together with Wolfie, they moved along the path. Emily was looking around curiously. Now, with Hugh walking beside her, tall and strong, and the faithful Wolfie trotting nearby, life didn't seem so hopeless to her. However, when the forest suddenly ended and they reached a row of dilapidated houses, the girl became scared and held onto his broad palm tighter and tighter. "You promised to be brave, didn't you?" Hugh smiled encouragingly at her, and Emily, sighing, straightened up and tried to stop trembling. Teresa lived in the outermost hut, the one closest to the forest. However, as they later discovered, it was the only inhabited house. The rest of the houses were empty, left behind by their owners, who had either moved away or passed away, lying here in the cemetery. The village, and the only woman who lived in it, would have been forgotten if it hadn't been for the fame of the healer, which spread many kilometres around. "Teresa, open up!" Hugh shouted while knocking on the door. Emily tried to hide behind Hugh's broad back. Meanwhile, the door creaked, and Teresa emerged into the light. At least, that's how Emily imagined her, in a long skirt and a shawl. Her head was covered with a scarf, despite the summer. Emily felt a chill and started to twist her palm, but Hugh held her firmly. "Is it you, Hugh?" the elderly woman asked. "It's me. Who else?" the man confirmed. "And who's with you?" Teresa put her palm, folded visor, to her forehead. It seemed to the girl that the strange woman could see through her now. "Well, I found her in the woods," Hugh shrugged. "She can't speak. She only writes that her stepmother left her in the woods." "She's not lying," Teresa declared. "I can smell a lie a mile away, and that little girl was really hurt. And what do you want from me?" "Heal the girl," Hugh requested, placing Emily, who was stubborn, in front of him. "She's not naturally mute, just afraid. Can you help?" "Maybe I can." Teresa kept her gaze on the pale girl. "Only it's difficult to overcome fear. She's still afraid, even of me, aren't you?" She turned to Emily. After a moment's thought, Emily nodded. "You see," Teresa shrugged, "it won't work. Let the doctors treat her. We should send the child to town, to a good hospital." "We can't send her to town," said Hugh. "Either they'll put her in an orphanage, or she'll be returned to her stepmother. That's most likely, and she could destroy her altogether." "And maybe they won't." Teresa squinted. "If the proper authorities keep an eye on her. You have an acquaintance there, don't you?" Emily felt Hugh, behind her, freeze immediately. "We're not going to talk about that," he said quietly, but in a way that made the grandmother's desire to sneer disappear. "Are you going to treat the girl, or shall I take her back to the forest?" The elderly woman remained silent, chewing her lips. "You're a fool, Hugh, but it's your business, and I won't interfere. All right, I'll see what I can do. Leave the girl." Emily shuddered, but Hugh let out a relieved sigh. "Thank you, Teresa. God give you good health," he said sincerely. "I've brought some forest guests here. Indulge yourself." Teresa's eyes twinkled, but her expression remained stern. "Unload the presents on the porch," she commanded. "And you, my dear, come to me," she said to the girl in a suddenly affectionate tone. "Come, come, I won't eat children. My teeth aren't the same now." It seemed to Emily that the elderly woman winked, although it was difficult to tell from such a distance. Hugh nudged the girl towards the porch and followed Teresa into the house. The girl hesitated, standing near the porch. "Why don't I run back to the woods?" A stray thought flashed through her mind, and then she felt Wolfie nudge her nose, as if urging her to comply. Emily turned around and looked at the wild creature. It was whimpering, trying to wag its tail, and seemed to be smiling. Emily took a deep breath, climbed the creaky steps to the porch, and went inside. Inside was interesting. She couldn't find another word for it, as her eyes darted around. And there was so much to see, because in this house the most incredible things coexisted. For example, iron on coals, and a laptop, bundles of herbs on the walls, and various flasks, like the ones Emily had seen in chemistry classes. Seeing the girl's face filled with surprise, Hugh and Teresa laughed. "That's how I am, a modern witch," proclaimed the elderly woman, proudly surveying the laboratory. "Don't be surprised that I live in the forest. I choose to live far away from the hustle and bustle, closer to nature." Teresa got her doctoral thesis on herbs, Hugh added. "People come to her from all over the country for advice and treatment, and she even got me back on my feet." "You're on your feet, but your brains are still not in order," grumbled Teresa. Hugh tried to say something, but she cut him off. "And since you don't want to listen to anything, let's keep the conversation short. Leave the girl and go on your way. We'll figure it out without you." Hugh laughed again, winked at Emily and said, "Look how stubborn she is." Crouching beside the girl, he wiped away her involuntary tears and said, "Don't be afraid of anything. Teresa won't harm you. We'll come to visit soon, and you'll see. You'll start talking by then." And yet the girl was afraid to be alone with Teresa. Meanwhile, the elderly woman scrutinized her carefully, then came up and unexpectedly hugged her tightly by the shoulders. "I see that life has taken away your faith in people. Hugh was like that when I met him, here in the woods. He came here to die. That's how it was. I healed his body, but I couldn't heal his soul. I look at you and wonder if it's a problem for you," Teresa said. Emily looked at the old woman incomprehensibly. "Well, let's have tea. We can also eat berries. Do you like berries?" Teresa asked. Emily nodded. "Good. Then get some cups from the locker over there," Teresa instructed. Emily reached over, opened the door and gasped. There stood a whole set of indescribable beauty, made of the finest and most transparent porcelain. Bring it, it's for using, not admiring," encouraged Teresa. And still Emily took the cups carefully, using only 2 fingers, afraid of damaging such a miracle. But the tea from those cups was 100 times tastier. It was with crushed berries, smelling like summer brewed in a kettle, and with each sip the girl breathed easier, and her fears and anxieties went away. Emily raised her eyes to the elderly woman, sitting opposite and smiling. "Well, how is the tea? Magical, isn't it?" Emily nodded and smiled back, although not bravely. "Do you know about living water?" Teresa continued the conversation. "Well, everything here is alive, but it doesn't help everyone, only the good and kind, and those who are ready to be healed. Are you ready?" Emily nodded again. She really liked this fairy tale woman, even though she had seemed like an angry witch at first. "That's good," approved Teresa. "Now we'll finish our tea, clean up the dishes, and then we'll go to drive away your ailments." Emily looked wary. She wondered how they were going to drive her sickness away. However, after thinking about it, she decided not to be afraid. It couldn't be worse than at her stepmother's, that was for sure. After clearing the table and washing the dishes in a large basin, they set off along the path through the field. Emily walked beside Teresa, admiring the grass and flowers. Under the approving gaze of the elderly woman, she wove herself a luxurious wreath and placed it on her head. "Beautiful," appreciated Teresa, and Emily felt quite cheerful. And maybe everything really would be fine, like in a fairy tale. Now she really wanted to believe it. The path led to a river, which banks were overgrown with lilies. Clouds floated in the water, and the girl involuntarily looked at them, feeling light and free. Teresa was the first to take off her blouse and skirt, revealing a simple nightgown made of plain material. She straightened her back and suddenly seemed less ancient to the girl. Emily, embarrassed, also undressed and touched the water with her toes. "It's cold. Brr. Be brave, my girl, otherwise the water won't take away your illness," sternly said Teresa from behind. Emily took a step, another, and suddenly went under the water almost completely. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a wheeze came out of her throat. Teresa, standing a step away, took a handful of water and poured it on the girl, muttering something under her breath. And then the fear suddenly disappeared. Emily's breathing evened out, and she felt the bottom under her feet. All she had to do was take a step, it turns out. "Try saying something," Teresa demanded. "Sing!" "Ah!" The girl managed to utter, to sing. Her voice wouldn't obey, but now she knew for sure she would definitely speak again. "Good girl," praised Teresa. "The river has accepted you, agreed to help you. We'll come here every day, and everything will work out." Emily nodded. She didn't want to get out of the water herself now, and splashed around near the bank. "Here," Teresa tossed her a wreath. "Give it to the river as a thank you for the cure." Emily stroked the flowers and carefully pushed the wreath into the current. The river picked up the gift and gently carried it away along with the clouds. The girl watched it go and smiled. She felt so good now, and the world, which wasn't only evil and cruel, was shining with new colours. On the bank, however, it turned out that her skin was covered with large goosebumps, and she clenched her teeth while the caring woman rubbed her with a big terry towel. It was more fun to go back along the same path. Emily ran ahead, plucked blades of grass, and generally behaved like an unruly puppy. Teresa smiled at her and looked younger herself. Once inside the cabin, Emily suddenly felt hungry. She glanced at Teresa, who was serenely reading on the sofa. The girl mumbled, trying to get her attention. However, the woman either didn't hear or was too engrossed in her reading to turn her head. Emily approached closer, patted her belly, and made a mooing sound a few more times. "Don't moo, speak with words." Without lifting her head, Teresa scolded her. Emily felt indignant in her mind, thinking, "How can I speak with words? I can't." "So, it's not much of your need," the grandmother calmly responded, noticing her confusion. Emily tensed up. Sounds were bubbling in her throat, but they refused to come out. She imagined them as billiard balls. All she had to do was hit each one with an invisible cue and make them roll down her throat. Mentally, she picked up 3 balls and pushed. Unexpectedly, the sounds escaped her. Teresa interrupted her reading and stroked Emily's head. "Well done," she praised. "Everything will work out for us. We just need to try. And now we'll eat. Take a bowl, go to the backyard. I have chickens there. Collect the eggs. We'll fry them. Oh, how delicious it will be." Still not fully recovered from the shock, Emily went to the yard. There were indeed motley chickens and a brightly coloured rooster wandering around. Under his disapproving crowing, the girl collected 5 eggs from the straw and returned home with a triumphant look. "Well done," Teresa smiled, and soon the hut was filled with the delightful aroma of fried eggs. It turned out to be incredibly delicious. Emily picked up the last crust from the plate and closed her eyes like a satisfied kitten. However, Teresa did not share the same joyful mood. It was as if she was listening to something inside her. Then she went to the door, opened it, and barely had time to step back before Wolfie burst into the house. The wolf whimpering, rushed around the hut, looking back at the door as if calling someone. And Emily noticed with horror the blood on his fur. "Something has happened to Hugh," Teresa shouted. "He must have run into poachers. Stay here. I'll call for help. I told you to wait here." But Emily could no longer hear the elderly woman's shouts behind her. She followed Wolfie out of the house, and they raced along the same road on which Hugh had brought her here. Wolfie constantly looked back to check if she was following him. The girl was running, her heart beating as if it were going to jump out of her chest. Wolfie jumped out into the clearing and howled. The girl shuddered when she saw a man lying in the grass. She rushed over to him, squatted down, and tried to turn him over. For a moment, it seemed like Hugh wasn't breathing. His camouflage pants were soaked with blood. Emily got dirty, but she continued to shake him, hoping he was still alive. Wolfie whimpered next to her, nudging his muzzle against his friend. And when Emily finally despaired of bringing Hugh back to life, a hoarse "Daddy" came out of her throat. And the first miracle was followed by the second. Hugh groaned and turned over, looking at the girl in amazement. "Emily, is that you? Why are you here?" he asked with difficulty. "Daddy!" sobbed Emily, looking at the bloody grass. Hugh tried to sit up but couldn't and wrinkled his nose. "I tried to get those local poachers who have long been tormenting the forest dwellers, but they shot both of my legs." Hugh tried to move his legs, but nothing happened. "Emily, I have a knife in my bag on my belt. Try to cut the jacket and bandage them." The girl composed herself, tears drying up on their own. Hugh helped her open the folding knife, and Emily began to work. The strong material didn't want to give in, but she managed, and she was horrified when she saw what had happened to Hugh's legs below the knees. She looked up at him with widened eyes, conveying that the situation was bad. "Don't lose hope, darling. We've gotten out of troubles like this before," he encouraged either Emily or himself. "Cut the cloth into long strips and tie them as tightly as possible," he requested. "I'll try to crawl. In these woods there are not only wolves wandering about, but other dangerous beasts as well, including two-legged ones." Following the wounded man's advice, Emily tightly bandaged his legs to stop the bleeding, bringing relief to both of them. With Emily's help, Hugh turned over onto his stomach and attempted to crawl. It was slow progress, but it was working. They took breaks when Hugh grew tired, and Emily wiped the sweat from his forehead. Wolfie licked Hugh's pale face with its long tongue and whimpered. "We'll make it, I know we will," Hugh whispered with determination as he continued to crawl persistently. Several hours seemed to pass. Emily did not know how many. Time lost all meaning, and then Hugh's strength left him, and he lost consciousness. Emily jumped to her feet, ran frantically around the clearing, and then a dam burst in her throat, and all over the forest there was a resounding "Help!" She screamed and begged for a miracle. And then the miracle happened. The forest was filled with the crackling of branches. A tall woman rushed into the clearing, rushed to Hugh, sat down next to him, hurriedly opened the first aid kit. After her, a huge grey-haired man came in the same camouflage suit as Hugh's, jumped out of the bushes. "Chuck, we need to get him inside the house as soon as possible," the woman ordered, glancing back at Emily. She asked, "Run to the house and boil water, lots of it. Do you remember the way?" Wolfie appeared nearby, and Emily followed him, trusting that the giant man would carry Hugh in his arms. Teresa emerged from the forest hut to meet them. How did the car manage to get here? Emily wondered, noticing the SUV parked behind the hut. Can this strange elderly woman still drive? They quickly boiled water and prepared bandages and cotton. When the door opened, a moaning Hugh was brought into the house by the hulking Chuck, who seemed to fold almost in half. The woman followed closely behind. revealing her stunning beauty. She was simply breathtaking. Hugh was laid on the table, and both women busily attended to him. "Let's not interfere." Chuck's large hand rested on the girl's shoulder. Obeying him, Emily went out into the courtyard and finally let her tears flow. She sobbed, uttering incoherent syllables, while Chuck silently comforted her, saying, "Don't be afraid of Hugh, daughter. He has overcome many challenges before. He saved my life twice, and not just mine. Now it's time to equal the score. We will catch those bandits and punish them, have no doubt." Gradually, Emily calmed down, her trembling shoulders growing still. Teresa came out of the house, embraced the girl and spoke lovingly. "You're mistaken, Chuck. It wasn't us. It was she who saved his life today. And I had told Hugh back then that he would have a daughter, and it turned out to be true." "Has he regained consciousness?" Chuck inquired. Emily sensed that there was something they weren't telling her. "Are you asking about Nina?" Teresa chuckled. "She hasn't left his side, standing guard while he sleeps. They will finally have a chance to talk." "Hugh's stubborn." Chuck shook his head. "He still hasn't forgiven Nina after all these years." "What a fool he is," Teresa calmly replied. "His mother didn't want to share her son with his bride. She told Hugh that Nina got rid of his unborn child, and he believed it. He never returned home, signed a contract, and after that she had a miscarriage. It wasn't her fault. I know that for a fact." "And if he hadn't signed, I wouldn't have been rescued by him," Chuck sighed. "That's just how it happened. It's like fate." "Fate?" Teresa agreed, her eyes suddenly shining brightly. "Did also fate compel you to rush to your friend's aid at the first call?" "It seems so," Chuck nodded. "I was on a training exercise, and I flew the helicopter up here." He laughed, causing Emily to shudder. "You'll come back and fly from your post for self-rule," said Teresa sarcastically. Chuck simply raised an eyebrow and stretched, saying, "Well, I wouldn't be so sure. Where will they find another specialist of my caliber?" "And Nina arrived here to save him immediately," Teresa mused. "Hugh got lucky to have both of you." "Lucky," Chuck agreed, glancing at Teresa. "Do you think I'll ever be lucky?" "There you go again." The woman waved her hands. "Chuck, I'm already old. You're only 6 years younger than me. You're a handsome man. You should find someone younger." "Oh, Teresa, I don't need someone young." Chuck shook his grey beard. "I need someone I love." "Why did we start talking about this in front of the child?" Teresa sighed, and Emily was astonished to see the youthful sparkle in her eyes. The door opened and a pale Nina stepped towards them. "Is he awake?" Teresa asked, gazing into her face. "Yes," said Nina with a trembling voice. "Kicked me out," and she covered her face with her hands. "All right." Teresa stood up resolutely, pushing Chuck to move. "Look after the girls here, and I'll go and talk some sense into this stubborn fool. I don't care if he's wounded." Chuck hugged the crying Nina. Emily, after a moment of thought, embraced her from behind and pressed against her, comforting the distressed woman. "Now, be silent and listen," resounded from the hut, making everyone shudder. "We didn't bring you back from the other world just so you could hurt yourself and Nina again." They did not hear what Hugh replied, but something clearly broke in the house. Then only incoherent muttering could be heard. After another half an hour, Teresa, obviously pleased with herself, came back out. "Nina, go into the house. You need to talk," she ordered in a tone that brooked no objection. Nina, looking helplessly at Emily, went into the house, and Teresa took her place and winked at the girl. "Don't worry, they'll figure it out. They have even more in common now than before. They'll definitely come to an agreement." While Chuck chopped wood behind the forest house to calm his nerves and find a purpose for himself, the elderly woman and the girl sat huddled together and waited for something. Then Teresa nodded. "That's it. We can go in." She walked first and froze in the doorway, blocking it with her body. Then she coughed and remarked caustically, "You'll have plenty of time for more conversations. You have your whole life ahead of you. And now, the tea will be just right." Nina, who had been agitated, distanced herself from Hugh and busied herself with setting on the table. There was nothing to remind them that it had recently been turned into a makeshift operating table. Hugh lay quietly and extremely thoughtful, but followed Nina with eyes full of tenderness. When Emily drank her tea, she noticed that Hugh's hand was gently stroking Nina's hand. "First aid has been provided. Now we must go to the hospital," Teresa said in a tone that brooked no objections. "I think they can manage without us now, especially since we have to decide about the girl." "It's already decided." Hugh looked at Emily and smiled. "You called me Daddy in the forest, didn't you? So I think you won't leave me, helpless and wounded." Emily shook her head and said with some difficulty, "No." Teresa looked at Nina and grinned. "Well, Nina, I suppose you'll have to use your official position once in your life. You're the children's ombudsman, right?" Nina nodded and looked at Hugh with a slight challenge. "Yes, and I know exactly how to punish those who harm children." "That's how we'll decide." Teresa took the initiative in her hands, seemingly accustomed to being in command. "Nina, let's put our wounded man in your jeep. You take the girl and decide with her guardian. And if she doesn't understand words, the guys and I will join in," chuckled Chuck, squinting at the commanding Teresa. "I don't think we'll need to, but thanks for the offer," Nina said. "Well, let's pack up. We still have to go to the hospital," Teresa continued. "Chuck, you can go back. They'll definitely catch you. They'll send troops to find their heroic colonel." "No need for troops," said Chuck, considering. "However, I have one more unfinished business here." And he looked meaningfully at Teresa. "Don't even think about it." She waved her hands. "What kind of avenger are you? This is a matter for the police. Stay out of it." Be quiet, woman," said Chuck, furrowing his thick eyebrows. "They have offended my friend, so they have offended me. Do you think I'm going to run to the police to complain? I said I'll take care of it myself." Surprisingly, Teresa remained silent. "We really should go." Nina looked at Emily and asked, "You're coming with us, aren't you?" The girl nodded, gathered her courage, and said, "Yes." "I told you that the treatment would help." Hugh smiled. "And you, don't be brave," Teresa said strictly. "You should recover first until the wedding." "Until theirs or ours," Chuck interjected, and Emily was amazed to see that the formidable witch could blush. She realized that the adults needed to pack, but she only had what she was wearing, so she hugged the wolf tightly. The wolf licked her face with its rough tongue, as if it knew they were going to be separated. "Wolfie," the girl said, struggling to speak. And then they were rushing first along the country road, then along the highway, and Hugh's head was lying in Emily's lap, and she was stroking his hair, begging someone up there. "You're the strongest, the smartest. You already have my own daddy and mummy. Leave Hugh with me. Don't take him away. I'll be very, very obedient. I'll help him and Nina with everything. Just make sure he gets better." It seemed that the child's prayer was answered. During his time in the hospital, Chuck took care of him, being there for his friend. Emily lived at Nina's place, and the latter took care of her case, sparing the girl's psyche so much that she didn't even have to meet her hated stepmother. Emily heard that stepmother's young husband had left her. When she returned without Emily and with an unclear explanation of what had happened, he filed for divorce. Perhaps some remnants of conscience remained. In contrast, Annabelle denied everything until she was shown the video with Emily's story. Nina wanted to make the punishment as severe as possible, but there was no direct evidence of an attempt on the child's life. However, the law hit the cruel woman where it hurt the most, her pocket, imposing a hefty fine. Custody was out of the question from now on, so Nina proposed her own candidacy for adoption. Her request was granted. When Hugh was discharged from the hospital, he and Nina filed the necessary documents at the registry office. By then, Emily, being a smart girl, had already understood from conversations with Hugh and Nina, had always loved each other, but were separated by the intervention of Hugh's mother. Life itself severely punished her for that. When Hugh, shocked by the perceived betrayal of his beloved, decided to join the military, his mother lost her peace and became very ill. At that time, Teresa, younger but no less sharp, tried to help her regain her strength, and the truth eventually came out. But it was too late. The mother passed away without seeing her son again, or finding redemption for her sins. Only now, after many years, did everything fall into place. One day, Nina, Hugh, and Emily visited the graves of the girls' parents. "I love you," whispered Emily, carefully placing flowers on the ground. "And I always will. Don't worry, now I have Hugh and Nina with me. Will you be mad if I call them Mum and Dad too? And I also have Grandma Teresa and Grandpa Chuck. They got married too, but they had an argument at first. Grandpa asked her to live with him, but she refused to leave the forest, so he moved in with her, and now he sometimes goes to work by helicopter. Don't miss me. I'll come to visit you often and tell you everything. Oh, you don't know. I used to be completely mute, but now everything is fine." Emily looked up and smiled at the sun, the sky, and the clouds. She had always believed in good fairy tales, and now she realized that her own personal fairy tale had a good beginning after all. Mrs. Riley was sitting in a chair gazing out the window at the passing clouds. She was a short woman with deeply wrinkled skin that spoke of her long and full life. Her brown, clear eyes still sparkled with life. Mrs. Riley's grey hair was neatly styled in curls. "Why isn't Simon calling?" she said quietly, reaching out for the phone. Her movements were slow and careful, as if she feared breaking it. It was her birthday today, but her only son hadn't rushed to congratulate her. "Maybe later," Mrs. Riley sighed, accustomed to the fact that her son was too busy with his own life to pay attention to her. "Well, that's enough. I am not going to mope any more," she exclaimed. This day was truly special. She was turning 80 years old. On such an anniversary, it was literally a crime to give in to despondency and sadness. Despite her advanced age and recent illness, Mrs. Riley got up from her chair decisively and made her way to the kitchen, holding onto the wall for support. Walking was difficult due to the stiffness in her joints, but fueled by the anticipation of the feast, Mrs. Riley briefly felt a surge of vigour and energy. She decided to cook an apple pie, which was one of her son's favourite desserts. Soon the appetising aromas filled the house, and then Mrs. Riley began to set the table. The beautiful tablecloth took its place, and the silverware emerged from a hidden drawer. Outside the window, the weather was grey, but the rooms of the almost empty house were filled with comfort and warmth. Most of the treats were for her son Simon, who lived not far away in the same town. However, he didn't often find the time to visit his elderly mother. Suddenly there was the sound of the front door opening. "Hello, are you home?" "Of course. Where would you go?" Simon called out and breathed in the aroma of the freshly cooked food with pleasure. Memories of his childhood in this house flooded back, making him slightly ashamed of his neglect, but only slightly. "Hello, Sonny," Mrs. Riley said as she stepped out of the kitchen into the hallway. She tossed aside the towel she was using to wipe her hands and embraced her son. He awkwardly patted her on the back and then disentangled himself from the embrace, handing his mother a bouquet of flowers. "How are you doing?" Simon muttered, taking off his jacket. "Oh, I'm getting along," his mother replied, relieved that her closest person had not forgotten about her special day after all. Mrs. Riley had so much to tell him and listened to stories about his life but Simon hurried to the kitchen, not paying much attention to her. "That's right, you must be tired from the journey, and hungry," Mrs. Riley said, unable to look at her only child objectively. And Simon grew accustomed to his mother's nurturing and pampering. She paid for his expensive education, bought him cars, and provided him with money whenever he asked. Perhaps she hoped to receive his love in return, but eventually she raised a narcissistic and idle individual. He never accomplished anything in life, although he was already 40 years old. Simon was a real disappointment, but not to his mother. "Come in, dear, the food is hot and fresh, just the way you like it," Mrs. Riley cooed, following behind her son. "Oh, a whole feast." The man skeptically shook his head as he sat down at the table. He had no idea how much effort it took for the 80-year-old woman to prepare the simple appetizers. Despite everything, Mrs. Riley felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her son's visit. She was certain that Simon was simply hiding his feelings, as is typical of boys, and deep down she hoped that he appreciated her life experience and wisdom. "Sonny, taste your favourite pie," she smiled, putting her arm around her long-awaited guest's shoulders. "Sure, I'll try it," Simon grumbled. Mrs. Riley ignored his displeasure and sat down on a chair next to him, mesmerized as she watched her son handle the fork. It had been a long time since she had seen someone eat her cooking with such enthusiasm. "So, is it good?" she asked. "Uh-huh." Every moment he spent with her felt precious to her. "How are you doing? Is everything all right?" she asked. Simon stood still for a moment, looking at his mother, as if trying to understand why she was asking. Not seeing any ulterior motive on her loving face, he simply shrugged. "Everything's fine, as usual," Simon continued chewing, "although some extra money wouldn't hurt." The undercurrent of hope in her son's voice made the woman uncomfortable, especially since she had already sent him a substantial sum not long ago. "Yes, indeed. Some extra money wouldn't hurt me either. The entire pension is spent on maintaining the house." The mother shook her head. Money had not always been a problem. Mrs. Riley was once known as a powerful and determined woman. She excelled in her career, holding management positions in many companies in the city. Her decision-making abilities, perseverance, and sociability made her a respected woman in town. "I'm amazed by your assertiveness. Not many women reach such heights," the mayor once told her at a social event. "There is nothing more valuable than success, right?" she replied then. But time spared no one. As the years went by, Mrs. Riley felt the need to take a break from the endless race for first place. She eventually decided to step down from leadership positions and devote herself to rest. However, by that time, her family had changed significantly. The son had long ago started living on his own, and her husband seemed to have forgotten about their shared happiness. And then he died altogether. "Did you visit Dad at the cemetery?" Mrs. Riley suddenly asked. Simon coughed, almost choking on another piece of pie. He grabbed the mug of juice, trying to ease the lump in his throat. "Mum, who thinks about a cemetery at a birthday party?" "Sorry," she sighed. The sudden loss of her husband 15 years ago was a serious blow for Mrs. Riley. She was left alone without her beloved partner. Pain and emptiness filled her heart, contributing to her withdrawal from social life. She preferred to spend her days in the solitude of her home, and only in her son's presence she found solace and the only spark of happiness. "By the way, it's good you mentioned the house," Simon said, coughing. Mrs. Riley looked at him in surprise, and only now did she notice a smug expression and a mischievous light in his eyes. She knew her son very well. Simon only acted this way when he expected to profit from something. But what kind of profit could he be talking about now? However, Mrs. Riley dismissed her suspicions, afraid of shattering the illusion of happiness that she had carefully built over the years. She simply smiled warmly, gazing happily at her son. Meanwhile, Simon rose from the table and began to inspect the kitchen meticulously. "Is this natural stone?" He nodded at the tiles. Of course, we picked out the best one with my father, nodded his mother. Good. Simon stretched out, taking a notebook out of his pocket. He walked out from behind the table, starting to walk around the room with an increasingly interested face. He examined every cabinet, scrutinized the walls, then moved quickly into the hallway, measuring doorways with a tape measure and taking measurements of the furniture and rooms. That couch, the leather one, right? He asked with visible greed in his voice. Of course, Mrs. Riley answered automatically. Great. How much is it? I don't remember. Why are you asking? She said, but her question remained unanswered. Simon wrote down everything he discovered in his notebook. It was as if the man strove to create a complete representation of the dwelling without omitting a single detail. What are you up to? Mrs. Riley asked worriedly. Just checking, waved Simon away and continued his journey through the house taking notes, exploring every corner of it. The notebook was getting more and more filled, and the man was getting happier, as if he'd discovered a real treasure trove. Do you want to renovate the house? Mrs. Riley asked. I don't need to. The house was in excellent condition. She and her husband had spent a lot of money when they were young to make it beautiful, and now all that was left was to maintain it. You know, Mum, there's a thing. The son finally deigned to answer. He hesitated a bit, as if not knowing how to approach the most important question, but Mrs. Riley knew her offspring too well to understand without words. Are you in trouble? She asked in a drooping voice. Not really in trouble, just temporary difficulties. Simon smiled awkwardly. I'm in a bit of debt, so I promised to sell the house and pay everything. But how could you, son? It's our memory, and where am I supposed to live? Will you take me to you? Cried Mrs. Riley. The thought of having to take an elderly mother to his home made the man shudder. He, of course, tried to hide his displeasure, but a fleeting grimace did not escape Mrs. Riley's attentive gaze, hurt her loving heart. You know, I have a buyer. Dr. Harvey is a very rich and influential surgeon, the son said. He has always dreamed of moving to this neighbourhood so that he could live not far from his clinic. Well, you know, it's not just a piece of land. It's a dream. Of course, that's why we bought it in the first place. Your father and I thought you and your wife would move here so our grandchildren would have a place to grow up, Mrs. Riley said quietly. But I don't have a wife and kids. Therefore, why do we need such a big place for the two of us? You said yourself you don't have enough money to maintain the house, so we'll find something not so huge. Simon frowned. But I'm used to it here. I don't want to move in my old age. Mum, you must get ready. Don't waste time. Simon said it firmly, changing his face. It was obvious that the son did not want to waste time on long persuasions. You don't worry. I've already arranged everything. I'll take you to a place. I think you'll like it there, Simon said, giving out a wry smile. To pack right now? Can we at least talk a little? Mrs. Riley still couldn't believe what was happening, as if everything around him was just a prank. Simon looked at her, expressing with one gaze both impatience and unwillingness to deal with his old mother's whims. He simply went to the closet, took out the suitcase with which she had once travelled on business trips, and began to pack. Sonny, well, where are we going to go? It's bad weather outside. But her son paid no attention to her entreaties. If, up to this point, Mrs. Riley had expected a little understanding, but now she realised that Simon would not change his decision. She would have to leave home, against her will, and go somewhere, and judging by the things he was packing in her suitcase, she would have to leave for a long time. Don't forget the underwear, the woman said quietly. Ah, yes, we'll take everything, waved Simon away. When he finished packing, the son placed his mother in his damaged car and started the engine. He hadn't been accustomed to taking care of his things since childhood, so his car appeared quite shabby. Driving out of the gate on the crunching gravel, the driver hurriedly left the place, wanting to get his mother away as quickly as possible, as if she could resist him. Meanwhile, the poor woman didn't know what to think. This was not the kind of treatment she had expected on her anniversary. "Where are we even going?" she muttered, gazing at the unfamiliar scenery. "Don't worry, you'll like that place," the son answered. A place? I wish you would tell me its name." "You'll see for yourself," muttered the son. Mrs. Riley let out a tired sigh and closed her eyes. She didn't realise when she began to doze off, lulled to sleep by the car's vibrations. It seemed they had been driving for at least a couple of hours before she was abruptly awakened by a sudden brake. "Oh!" the woman exclaimed, painfully hitting her knee on the dashboard. "I'm sorry," Simon replied, glancing indifferently at his mother. It seemed that his mother's condition bothered him much less than the deteriorating state of the car. Mrs. Riley looked around, bewildered. The surrounding countryside was completely unfamiliar. The woman wanted to question her son, but from his expression she realised that Simon was not wanting any conversation at all. She glanced around, but only saw an abandoned, dilapidated village, lost in the middle of nowhere. Time seemed to have forgotten this place, leaving behind reminders of its former grandeur. Old houses with cracked walls welcomed occasional travellers, their faded facades weathered like faces that had lost their youth. "Goodness, what is that?" Mrs. Riley sighed. "It's nothing. People still live here." Simon shrugged. "Are you joking?" "Well, not everyone has as much money as you," the son replied reproachfully. "I didn't get them out of nowhere. I've earned it all by myself." "Now it's time. Oh, well, never mind." Simon became irritated, abruptly ending their conversation. He carefully drove the car deep into the village, searching for the right house. The winding paths of the settlement had long been overgrown with grass, making their last effort to hold on to the abandoned land. Grasses and flowers bloomed boldly along the roadside, pushing their way through the ruins of the past. "Is there even phone reception here?" Mrs. Riley asked, shocked. "What do you need it for? You never use it anyway." "What if I need to call an ambulance?" "As if they would come here," Simon replied half-heartedly. "Oh, even the navigator doesn't work," the man muttered, poking his finger at the useless cell phone. They had to rely on withered signs to reach their destination. "Well, we're home," the son exhaled with a relief. Mrs. Riley looked out of the window, completely puzzled. They stopped outside a run-down shack, just as dilapidated as the rest of the neighbourhood. "You need to stay here for a while until I sell the house. Then I'll find you a better place to live," the son said as he got out of the car. "How can I live here?" The mother shook her head in disbelief. Even in her distant childhood, the wooden house she was born in did not look so impoverished. Simon impatiently opened the passenger door, extending a hand to help her. There was no choice. Her son was determined to put her here. Mrs. Riley let out a heavy sigh and tried to get out, but a sharp pain shot through her bruised knee. She grimaced, attempting to soothe the joint, while her son literally dragged her out of the car. "Don't be grumpy, it's just an ordinary house. It's been vacant for a while. You'll spend here only a couple of weeks," Simon said. Mrs. Riley gasped in pain. She had no energy left to argue with her son. She obediently followed him, limping more with each step. "Well, come in," Simon muttered, unlocking the creaking door. The house was filled with a stale smell, and thick clouds of dust floated in the air. "In the suitcase you'll find everything you need. Clothes, medicine. I'll bring groceries later. There's actually a store nearby." "You took my card. And my money," Mrs. Riley whispered. "Oh, right. Then wait for me when I arrive." He placed the suitcase next to her, gave her the key, and walked back to the car without turning back. "Won't you stay with me for a while? His mother shouted after him. "You settle in, I have things to do. I'll come for a visit on the weekend. Just wait." The son waved his hand. The engine roared and Simon drove off, disappearing into the blue cloud emitted from the exhaust pipe. An anniversary and a housewarming. So many celebrations in one day. Mrs. Riley grinned bitterly as she surveyed her new home. Her nose tickled with dust, her knee ached, and tears welled up in her eyes. In the morning, she could have not imagined that her beloved son's visit would turn out like this. But now... Grasping the handle of the suitcase, Mrs. Riley carefully stood up and slowly made her way to the nearest room. She didn't want to sit in the hallway until the weekend. The necessary documents for the sale of her house were quickly processed. Her son took care of all the hassle of selling the house, to spare his beloved mother any unnecessary trouble. She only had to adjust to life in a new place, which was not easy. As expected, Mrs. Riley couldn't sleep on the first night. The mattress on the creaky old bed was as hard as a rock. Old age was already hard enough to bear, and here was not even a hint of the comfort a pensioner needed. Could he really do this to his own mother? Mrs. Riley thought, tossing and turning. Later on, she learned from her neighbours that Simon had bought this dilapidated house from some swindler for a mere penny. Meanwhile, time went on. Simon, as promised, showed up on weekends with a few bags of cheap groceries, but never stayed for a visit. "Sorry, I can't stay, I have a lot to do," he quickly said, already heading towards the exit. "Well, at least have some tea," his mother said pitifully. "No time, I'll come back later." He waved her off. Several more weeks passed. During this time, her son didn't visit once, only sending her some money. Mrs. Riley gradually began to get used to her unfortunate situation, although her aching legs continued to bother her. The pain-relieving ointment she had brought from home was running out, and she didn't even know where her nearest centre of civilization was. "Tea is running out too," Mrs. Riley sighed. This meant that she would have to make a trip to the store, which wasn't very far away, but with her sore leg and limp, the walk could take the entire day. Suddenly a strange noise came from the front door. The locked lock clicked as if a key had been turned. The rusty hinges creaked. Mrs. Riley froze on her stool, listening intently to what was happening. Thieves? No, they wouldn't use keys, would they? Maybe Simon returned, but his car would have been visible from the window. The woman trembled with fear as she heard confident footsteps, which, judging by the sound of creaking floorboards, were heading towards the kitchen. "What's going on here?" the man who entered exclaimed, looking around at the bewildered elderly woman. "Hello," was all Mrs. Riley could manage to say. The first glance at the guest sent a chill down her spine and made her heart skip a beat. The guy appeared to be no older than 25, tall and thin. However, the sight of his tense muscle beneath the light windbreaker conveyed a sense of physical strength. His eyes were like burning coals that penetrated deep into her soul, carrying stories of cruelty and survival that were unfathomable. The grim yet intelligent expression on his face revealed that this young man had witnessed more than his fair share at such a young age. Mrs. Riley noticed the prison tattoos and became even more frightened, unable to comprehend how this man had ended up here. She was certain she had never seen him before. "Are you attempting to steal anything here?" A bitter grin played on his narrow lips. "My son bought this house for me," Mrs. Riley said, gathering her courage. "Really? So while I was in jail, somebody already resold my hovel?" The stranger shook his head. "In prison?" Mrs. Riley asked. "Yes, for 4 years. I kicked a big shot, and judging by such a big sentence, I must have left them crippled," an ominous voice replied. "Oh, my goodness. I haven't taken anything here. Everything is just as it is. I just tied it up a bit. Perhaps it was a mistake. I'll call my son." "There's no cell phone reception here." The ex-con shook his head. Mrs. Riley fell silent, her head pulled back into her shoulders. She didn't know what to do in this situation. What could she, an old woman, do against a young and intimidating man? "I'm sorry," Mrs. Riley said quietly. "I have nowhere else to go. My house is far away, or rather it was. Could I at least wait in the garden on the chair for my son while we figure out what to do?" The stranger frowned at her with a stern gaze. Something in her words didn't please him, darkening his mood. Mrs. Riley was filled with fear, expecting the stranger to strike her on the head and be done with it. She even closed her eyes, but instead she heard the man quietly sit down beside her. "Don't be afraid. What kind of beast do you think I am, to throw you out on the street?" A softened voice came. "My name is Brian. Don't assume that just because I've been in prison, I'm necessarily a murderer." Mrs. Riley opened her eyes uncertainly, looking at her interlocutor. The guy tried to smile, soothingly raising his open palms. His face was actually pleasant, even handsome. Somehow he seemed accustomed to frowning most of the time, and had rarely radiated friendliness lately. "Would you like some tea, then?" Mrs. Riley asked cautiously. "That would be great," he nodded. "Unfortunately, I don't have much tea left." "That's all right. I drove through town and bought some supplies." Brian gestured towards the backpack lying in the hallway. Mrs. Riley wanted to start cooking, but the guest, observing her difficulty in moving, Brian didn't allow her to fuss. He took matters into his own hands, putting an old kettle on the stove and preparing a simple dinner. It turned out that he was the previous owner of the house before he went to jail. "And I ended up there accidentally," the guy said as he sliced sausage. "Can you imagine? I stood up for a girl. I was walking down the street in the evening, and I saw two people harassing her, dragging her into their car. I stood up for the girl and beat them up. Who knew that among the children of rich parents there could be rapists?" "What a horror!" Mrs. Riley shook her head sincerely. "So you served time for something you didn't do? So many years of torment? And what about the girl? Didn't she testify in court?" "She disappeared somewhere. She must have run away out of fear. Well, the main thing is that she wasn't harmed." "I hope so. My fiancé, with whom I lived, only visited me twice. She slipped me a piece of paper to sign. Now I understand she sold the house. After that, she changed her address. In fact, I went to town to see her, not just for groceries." "So it's all illegal, then?" Mrs. Riley exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "Of course it is. But if the case goes to court, they will believe her, not the ex-con. I've served 4 years, and there's no way to remove such a stigma," he replied. "I'm sure there's some help available." "You're a wonderful woman, Mrs. Riley. At your age, you still believe in fairy tales," he smiled. The evening crept up unnoticed. They finished dinner and then settled themselves comfortably in the living room. "By the way, I am an orphan," Brian continued the interrupted story, fixing up the TV. "From my early years, so to speak, I've been on my own. I didn't know my family, never saw my parents. Then I fell in love with Megan, my fiancée, who had sold this house." "I'm so sorry for you," said Mrs. Riley's head sadly. "I have a son, and I don't know what kind of person you'd have to be to give up your own little boy to an orphanage." "No offence, Mrs. Riley, but your son wasn't too worried when he sent you here." "Well, it's only temporary. Now he'll pay off his debts and then he'll find a better home." Brian furrowed his eyebrows incredulously, but didn't argue. Why upset an elderly woman unnecessarily? It was clear to him that the good-for-nothing son would leave his mother to live out her life in a shanty village, forgotten by everyone. "Well, all right, if that's the case. But honestly, if I had at least one soulmate, I wouldn't abandon her and refuse to help her." "You'll see, he won't leave me either," Mrs. Riley sighed bitterly. The old TV showed streaks of colour and a muffled sound came from the hoarse speakers. Brian hummed contentedly, carefully putting the TV back. "Well, it's possible to live. Things will get better little by little, he smiled. Frankly speaking, I don't know when Simon will come. I'll ask around the village. Maybe someone has a phone, said Mrs. Riley with a guilty expression. Don't worry. Stay as long as you need. There's plenty of room. I'll sleep on the sofa. You sleep in the bedroom. So, they started to live together, the abandoned mother and the former convict. From the outside, one could think that the grandson came to visit his grandmother. The guy turned out to be handy and industrious, and he quickly cleaned up the yard that had been left unattended for 4 years. Brian got a job as a loader and slowly began to make repairs in the house. Does it hurt much? He asked once again when he saw Mrs. Riley rubbing her knee. A little. If it weren't for you, it would have gotten worse, the woman replied. We'll go to the doctor again tomorrow. Oh, come on. I don't want to bother you. It's decided. I'll order a cab and we won't have to push ourselves on the bus. Don't argue. You won't change my mind, and if I need to, the guy said with a sinister face, I'll drag you to the general practitioner by your hand. Mrs. Riley only smiled embarrassedly at the joke, thinking how lucky she was to have met him. He was always helping and caring, never once approaching her for invading his home, and everything would be all right. But the woman's health was getting worse every day. It was no longer just her knees. Apparently the stress of the last few months had shaken the body. Well, Mrs. Riley, I have nothing to please you, said her doctor. You know you can't improve anything at your age. If she needs medicine or procedures, just tell me, I'll get everything. Brian intervened. Young man, unfortunately, procedures or pills for old age have not yet been invented. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Brian sank into his chair. The words made him sad because in the unexpected neighbour he had finally found the family warmth he had never seen in his life. It even seemed that life began to get better. And now this. Rest, less stress, less strain, and many positive emotions, the doctor added, holding out a prescription for painkillers for the knee. Brian helped Mrs. Riley get ready, and taking her carefully under his arm, led her to the hospital exit. On the way they were silent, each thinking about their own thoughts. When they returned home, the man immediately put Mrs. Riley to bed, forbidding her to make a fuss about household chores. He took the doctor's advice too seriously, deciding to surround Mrs. Riley with as much care as possible. Brian was about to go to the store when suddenly he heard the sound of a motor right under the windows. The car honked a couple of times and then a frowning man got out. He had never seen Simon, but he immediately guessed who finally showed up to visit them. All this time, Mrs. Riley almost every day remembered her son, who did not send a penny for living. Well, hello, greeted the uninvited guest glumly, stepping out onto the porch. Who the hell are you? Simon raised an eyebrow in surprise. The owner of the house. Ah, you must be the convict Megan used to date with, muttered Simon, recalling a long-ago conversation. Don't you want to ask how your mother is doing? He asked reproachfully. None of your business. Simon wanted to go into the house, but Brian pushed him, causing him to almost somersault down the high steps. Are you crazy? Do you want to go to prison again? I'll call the police right away. Are you going to write a letter? The phones don't work here. If I have to, I will. Why don't you tell them about the real estate scam and about how you cheated the elderly mother without any remorse? Brian said threateningly. As if they care about old women. Simon frowned. He tried once more to go inside, but Brian pushed him away again, this time harder. Simon stumbled, struggling to keep his balance, grabbing the nearest post with his hand. Hearing the noise, Mrs. Riley went to the window and almost cried at her son's harsh words. Simon, don't quarrel, she shouted, swinging open the glass casement. Well, hello, Mum, immediately echoed the cowardly son. Tell that to your watchman, better. Are you here to pick me up? It's been months since the house was sold. Have you found anything? I haven't found anything yet, the man said briefly. When Brian heard this, he only hummed. Mrs. Riley felt her legs weakening. It appears that Brian was right. Her son apparently had no intention of taking her away from the village. "Why did you come, then?" said the mother in a drooping voice. "There's this thing. I wanted to ask for money. Well, a loan, of course. Work isn't going well until next month, and then everything will be back to normal," Simon said. "You took my card with my pension, and you've taken all my savings. What more do you want?" said Mrs. Riley, almost crying. "Maybe you've got some more money stashed away." "You're quite mad," Brian gasped at this insolence. The ex-convict had seen many scoundrels behind bars, but he had never encountered such a scum as Simon. So he had no further intention to talk to him any more. Brian moved menacingly toward him, lifted him by the collar, and threw him forcefully toward the gate. "I'll sue you," shouted Simon, hastily picking himself up from the ground. "Go ahead, if your conscience allows it." Boiling with anger, Brian stepped towards the insolent man again, but Simon realized that he couldn't match the young man's strength, so he immediately ran to the car. The engine roared angrily, the exhaust pipe sneezed blue smoke, and Simon drove away. "I don't even want your spirit here anymore," shouted the furious Brian after him. Then he rushed into the house to check on Mrs. Riley's well-being. He was afraid that the son's behaviour would have an irreparable impact on his mother. But he found Mrs. Riley sitting on a stool. She looked sadly into the distance, holding back the tears that had accumulated in the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry, but sometimes I can't help myself. It's just like that time when those two tried to offend the girl." It's okay. You know, it's like my eyes have finally been opened to him. How did a funny little boy grow up to be like that?" "I don't know, Mrs. Riley. I guess you went wrong somewhere in your upbringing." The man shrugged. It might have been rude to say so, but he couldn't hide his attitude towards her son. "Well, there was no upbringing at all sometimes. I worked to provide the best things for him, and I thought it would be enough, but I was wrong, and now I'm just dealing with it." "Don't be sad. Everything will work out," he responded. "You're a good man, though you've never seen affection in your life. You've been wronged by fate, but you grew up right. I was lucky to meet you in my old age. Please help me to my bed, or I'm getting a little uncomfortable." Brian immediately gave the older woman his hand. Mrs. Riley made herself comfortable and dozed off, while Brian went to the store, intending to cook something tasty for dinner to cheer her up. Several days had passed since Simon's arrival. Mrs. Riley had not been able to get out of bed, spending more and more time sleeping. The pills helped to relieve the pain in her knee, but her body was increasingly demanding rest. The worst was that Brian could not influence the situation, so he tried at least not to disturb the woman, providing the opportunity to spend the last days in peace and comfort. "Brian, come to me, please," suddenly said Mrs. Riley in a weak voice, when he once again passed the bedroom. "What's wrong?" he asked worriedly. "Nothing," smiled Mrs. Riley weakly. "I have one request. There is a little thing that is critical to me. There's a shed in my former house at the very edge of the plot. I made a hiding place there as my heart felt it would come in handy. Simon sold the house, but I'm sure he didn't look in the shed." A single tear rolled down, making Mrs. Riley embarrassed by her own sentimentality. She wiped herself with her handkerchief, calmed down a little and continued. "There's a little box lying there under the floorboards. Would you bring it to me? I'll be grateful for it forever." "Mrs. Riley, don't worry. I'll deliver it in the best way," Brian promised, taking her hand. "I'll go right now. Just tell me the address and the exact place where the box is." Not half an hour later, the young man was on the bus. The road took several hours, because Simon took his elderly mother too far from the city. When he walked through the neighbourhood, his eyebrows rose at the sight of rich mansions. The young man had suspected before that Mrs. Riley was a wealthy woman before, but only now did he truly realise how much. "And he's got a nerve, coming to her to demand more money. 1/10 of what he'd get for selling a house like that should last him several years, thought the ex-con. The shed was indeed in the place where Mrs. Riley had pointed out. It was a ramshackle structure on the boundary line between the plots. It had not been torn down because no one needed it, and it did not attract anyone's attention because it was hidden in the bushes. Brian cautiously looked around to see if anyone was watching. There were no passers-by around. There might not have been a better moment. The shed was unlocked, and he carefully slipped inside. The box was hidden at the very back of the building, under an inconspicuous doormat. "Wow, a hiding place indeed," he whispered, scrutinizing the box nestled in the recess. "Mrs. Riley's an ingenious woman. Why not rent a safe deposit box in a bank?" The carved box was locked and quite heavy. He wondered what could be hiding in such a strange stash. He had originally assumed that the elderly woman kept letters or photos there, but judging by the weight, it was not paper. Brian took the box under his arm and was about to leave when suddenly he heard a persistent cough. "I thought I was imagining things," said the man standing nearby the shed. A middle-aged man with a neat haircut and thin-rimmed glasses observed Brian with deep, scrutinizing eyes, as if deciding what to do with him next. "Don't think I'm a thief," Brian said immediately, realizing how suspicious he must have seemed. "Well, what would you call it then?" nodded the man, indicating the box in the ex-con's hands. "Let me explain. I was sent by the former owner of the house, Mrs. Riley. She had something important here. She couldn't take it before she moved, so she asked me to bring it to her." That doesn't sound convincing so far. The man who sold me the house claimed that his mother had passed away long ago." "That's not true. Simon, Mrs. Riley's son, moved her to a remote village. He sold the house to pay off his debts. Now she lives with me, but she's ill and old. I'm afraid this might be her last request." Dr. Harvey, the surgeon who had bought the house, looked doubtfully at the young man and contemplated whether to make the call or not to the police. Perhaps calling the on-duty squad should have been his first action. But Dr. Harvey was very curious about what the thief had been seeking behind in the old, unneeded shed. "Believe me, the last thing I want right now is trouble with the police. I wouldn't risk my freedom just to steal some obscure box." Brian shook his head. "I could have just brought Mrs. Riley here, but she's been feeling too ill lately. She can hardly get out of bed." "No need for that. I wouldn't recognize the former owner anyway. And any old lady could pretend to be the former owner," replied the surgeon. Brian sensed the man's hesitation about calling the police. He was about to make another attempt to convince him of his honesty when suddenly the front door of the mansion opened and a young girl appeared on the threshold. She exuded brightness and freshness, capturing everyone's attention. Her pleasant facial features seemed to create a magical harmony. Thick, silky auburn hair cascaded in waves across her shoulders. "Anna, please go inside. I'll be done soon," said Mr. Harvey. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" began the girl, but then her gaze fell upon Brian, and she froze, covering her mouth with her palm. "Hello? No more trouble?" Brian nodded, also recognizing in the surgeon's daughter the girl he had saved from the men. "Dad, it's him," muttered Anna. Her eyes welled up with tears as the events of that terrible evening flashed through her memory, causing her fragile shoulders to tremble once again. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" The girl rushed down the steps, heading confidently towards them. She was dressed in house slippers, a t-shirt and light shorts, brushing away the tears streaming down her cheeks. "My saviour!" she said, running up to Brian and embracing him. "I'm sorry I disappeared the other day. I didn't even get the chance to thank you. It was just so scary that I don't even remember how I made it home. It was all a blur." "It's all right. The main thing is that you were safe," smiled the young man, gently hugging her back. "And so," Dr. Harvey raised an eyebrow, "if I understand correctly—" "Yeah, Dad. He's the one who saved me from those ruffians in the back alley. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't shown up. By the way, what's your name?" "Brian," the young man introduced himself. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, Where did you go? I was searching for you, whispered Anna. It's a long and unpleasant story, shrugged the uninvited guest. Those thugs turned out to be the sons of wealthy parents. They accused me of attacking innocent men. 4 years in prison. I was only recently released. I met the former owner of this house and she sent me here.
I'm so sorry, said the girl with a trembling voice.
It turns out I owe you one, her father said. I didn't even know how badly you were hurt after saving Anna. Honestly, if I had known, I would have definitely gotten you out.
Let's go inside, it's getting cold. At least we'll give the hero some tea, said the girl, taking Brian's hand.
I'd like to go home. Mrs. Riley is all alone there, Brian said, overwhelmed by the attention.
I'll drive you home later, don't worry. We must at least somehow thank you for everything.
Dr. Harvey supported his daughter's initiative. They dragged the young man into the house, almost forcing him to join the dinner. Brian was a little shy, but he agreed to respect the hosts. He told of his misadventures, omitting the most unflattering moments, so as not to frighten the excited Anna.
What a horror, whispered Anna, after listening to the whole story.
It happens. Sometimes even the closest people give you up, and sometimes complete strangers are willing to sacrifice their lives, nodded Dr. Harvey, looking at Brian. What happened should not go unpunished. I will deal with Simon. There is a remedy for the likes of him. I wish you would, said Brian, glancing at his watch. I'm sorry, I was very glad to meet you, and if you like I'll drop in again sometime. But Mrs. Riley's all alone there now. I'm afraid to leave her for so long. Of course. As promised, I'll give you a ride home, Dr. Harvey said, rising from the table.
Goodbye, my saviour, said Anna, hugging the guy goodbye. Here's my phone number. Don't go missing again.
I won't, Brian promised, smiling.
The men left the house, got into a fancy car and set off. Understanding the impatience and anxiety of the guy, Dr. Harvey tried to drive at the limit of permitted speeds.
Here is my house, Brian rejoiced when he saw a familiar hut with a faint light burning in the window. Apparently Mrs. Riley was waiting for his return, having switched on a small bedside lamp. Would you like to meet her? Brian asked. Sure, I'll check her knee as a doctor as well, the man said. They got out of the car and went inside the house. The guest pensively looked at the poor decoration of the house, thinking about something of his own. Brian immediately hurried to the bedroom. I think she's fallen asleep, he whispered, looking at Mrs. Riley, who had covered her eyes.
The elderly woman was still in bed, half lying and half sitting on the pillows. In the fingers of her right hand, she was clutching a pen.
Brian, trying not to make any noise, put the box he had taken from the stash on the bedside table and wanted to turn off the light. Wait, said the surgeon quietly. He approached Mrs. Riley, leaned over her face, and then pressed his fingers to a point on her neck. What are you doing? Brian asked. We've been late. She's gone. What do you mean? Dazedly interrogated the young man, unwilling to accept the sad reality. No pulse. No breathing either. She didn't seem to be in agony, it's just time, the guest said, shaking his head. How could it be? Brian said bitterly, settling down on a stool. He had been preparing for this day for a long time, but now that sadness had come into the house. He was completely confused. Look, I think this letter is for you. Dr. Harvey stayed close by, realizing that the man needed support and distraction from his gloomy thoughts more than ever. What? Brian said it incomprehensibly. A letter, for you. The surgeon held out a yellowish sheet that lay on the nightstand under the lamp. With trembling hands, Brian accepted the note. Dear Brian, I want to write you this letter to convey my deep, sincere feelings of love and gratitude. Every day spent with you was a true treasure that warmed my heart until the end. Words cannot express how proud and happy I am to have met such a wonderful person. I want to thank you for brightening my passing life with your presence and bringing so much joy and warmth to my aging heart. You were there for me when I needed support, helping me through a scary time, and I hope that I was able to show you, even just for a little while,
what a family is. I want you to know that no matter where I am, my love will always be there for you. Never forget that you are a special and unique person, capable of bringing so much goodness. Don't let the weight of the past cloud your present, and please smile more often. I leave you my humble inheritance. The key to the box is on the table next to this letter. Open it and dispose of its contents as you see fit. With love and affection, your named Granny. The last lines echoed in Brian's mind. He couldn't hold back his tears and turned away, facing the wall. Dr. Harvey remained silent but stayed close, gently placing his hand on Brian's shoulder. He involuntarily became a participant in this very private moment, glad that he could support the young man during such a vulnerable time. They sat like that until Brian silently picked up a small key and inserted it into the keyhole of the box. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he managed to keep himself from bursting into sobs. The lock clicked softly and the carved lid folded open, revealing. Despite his condition, Brian couldn't immediately believe his eyes. Inside the box there was a collection of gold, silver and precious stone jewellery. What he saw made him dizzy. "Why did she leave them to me? How could I accept such a thing?" Brian whispered. "It was her final will, made in her right mind and full memory. Don't doubt it. Mrs. Riley wanted you to have them, probably as a thank you for your selfless care. I wish I could trade all this wealth for her health, even just for a few more days. Everybody's time comes, Brian. Don't hold on to her. Let her go to a better world. Continue with your life, having the memory of such a beautiful woman inside your soul." The man nodded, unable to find words to express himself. He was grateful that Dr. Harvey was there at such a moment. "I think Mrs. Riley had been collecting these treasures her whole life, but she didn't trust her irresponsible son with them. You can handle them with dignity. Don't be afraid. It's a heartfelt gift. It would bring her joy to see them bring happiness to someone in need." Brian organised a lavish funeral ceremony, inviting neighbours and the few relatives he could find through Dr. Harvey's connections. The only person they didn't contact was Simon. Brian couldn't forgive him for his behaviour. After the funeral, all he cared about was the lost inheritance. He even tried to sue, but Dr. Harvey stood up for him and put Simon in his place. Now Simon was left, biting his elbows and harbouring resentment towards everyone around him. 2 years had passed. Brian visited the cemetery once a month to pay his respects and share updates on his life with Mrs. Riley. "I've started my own business, and your inheritance wasn't spent on entertainment," Brian finished his story, touching the cold stone of the gravestone. "I earn good money, and I'm a respectable groom, so to speak." "Well, how are you, dear?" Anna quietly approached. "Don't be sad. Mrs. Riley will always be in your heart." 2 years ago, upon learning of Brian's loss, Anna immediately decided to support him and help him through his grief. The young people became close during this time. They often talked, called each other, and then they did not notice how they began to date. Brian's life really changed for the better, and he was sincerely grateful to the kind-hearted Mrs. Riley, thanks to whom all of this was possible. Shirley fought back the tears that welled up in her eyes and gathered her belongings from her office desk, a cup, a calculator, a calendar, and various small items. Her friend tried to calm her down. "Come on, Shirley, don't be so upset. It's just a job loss. You see, the company is on the verge of collapse. Salaries are being delayed, and since you joined later than everyone else, they decided to dismiss you first. You'll find a better job. You're still young. Besides, you have a wealthy fiancé, so you won't be left high and dry." The girl sniffled. "That's true. We have a wedding coming up, and now I'm unemployed. Oh, I can already imagine the sarcasm from my mother-in-law. She never liked me anyway. She thinks I'm not good enough for her son, coming from an ordinary family and working in the archives, and now she'll scold me for depending on Brad. But it's not my fault that my mother raised me on her own. We always struggled financially. My mother is just an accountant, not a millionaire. I couldn't even afford to go to college because I had to take an office management course after high school and start working. I had just settled in and gotten used to everything, and now I have to look for a job again. Such bad luck. Helen hugged her colleague and said, "All right, things will turn around, don't be so down. If your fiancé loves you, he'll understand. And as for his mum, just ignore her. You don't live with her, after all. Well, take care, darling. I wish you good luck." Shirley returned home feeling sad and shared everything with her mother. "Oh, my daughter, how unlucky, right before the wedding. Well, don't worry. Things will work out. Look through job vacancies. Maybe you'll find something you need." Shirley went to her room, changed her clothes, and collapsed on the bed, crying bitterly. How was she going to tell Brad? Brad's mother will definitely think that she is only dating her son for his money. Looking at a photo of her beloved, the girl remembered how they had met. It was so unexpected. On her way home from work, Shirley liked to stand on the bridge for a long time and gaze at the river. It always calmed her down. She did it almost every day. And one day, as the girl leaned on the railing, lost in the ripples on the water, she was frightened by a flash. It turned out that a young, attractive guy had taken her picture. Shirley looked at him, puzzled and startled, and he began to apologize. "I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. You're very beautiful. Do you mind if I keep this picture as a memento? Look, it turned out great." "Don't worry, I'm not a psycho or something like that. I'm just into photography, and I'm always looking for interesting shots. I have a whole collection at home. By the way, my name is Brad." Shirley blushed at his compliments and whispered, "And I'm Shirley. No, I don't mind at all. I just didn't expect someone to take my picture right here on the bridge. I often come here. I like looking at the water. It makes me feel so calm and peaceful inside." The shot had indeed turned out beautifully. A pensive girl in profile, with her blonde hair fluttering in the wind, against the backdrop of passing cars. And so the young people became friends, and soon realized that they were deeply in love with each other. They were drawn to each other like magnets, and not a day went by without them calling each other. Each date made them even happier. Brad was not an ordinary guy. He was the son of a businessman. In his 20s, he already had his own car, given to him by his parents. He dressed in the latest fashion, and had almost graduated from a prestigious college. Shirley, on the other hand, grew up in an ordinary, even poor family. Her mother Helen had raised her alone, and it was difficult to provide for Shirley on her own. But the woman always tried to make her daughter look just as good as everyone else. Shirley was now working as a file clerk for a company. The pay wasn't great, but the work was clean and organized. Initially, the girl was even afraid when she found out that Brad came from a wealthy family. She thought he would start flaunting his superiority, but no, Brad was surprisingly easy to talk to, open and not conceited at all. They were so good together that they soon decided to get married. Shirley's mother was overjoyed. She immediately took a liking to Brad, who was polite and tactful during their family dinner. However, Brad's parents were clearly not thrilled with Shirley. Mrs. Fuller pursed her lips and held back from biting harder, while Mr. Fuller looked down on Shirley with obvious condescension, showing off his importance. The mother tried to dissuade her son from attending the wedding. "Son, come to your senses. You're making a terrible mistake. Linking your fate with this beggar? She has nothing. She lives in some dump with her mother, has no higher education, and has no prospects. What do you see in this simple girl, huh? Look at Megan. She's on a whole other level, stately, well-groomed, and studying at a prestigious university. Her father has already bought her an apartment in the city centre." But Brad was adamant, and only got angry. "Mum, stop! Stop it! Why do you measure all people only by money? You married my father when he had nothing yet, and you yourself
are not blue bloods, so what's the matter? Why can't I marry for love? I've seen your Megan a few times. She's a cheeky girl and a troublemaker, but in essence she's nothing. I don't need her. I don't like her at all. Understand? I love Shirley, and that's it. Let's finish this unpleasant conversation. I do not need a lavish wedding, and I do not ask you for millions. We'll just get married and that's it. Mr. Fuller venomously remarked, Well, well, and where are you going to live? Lovebirds? Or are you thinking of bringing your bride to our mansion? And with what money will you support your family? Not mine, I hope. You're just graduating from college. You're not on your feet yet. Brad answered with heat, It's nothing. We'll live. We're renting an apartment now, and that's okay. I work part-time. The main thing is that we love each other, and the rest will come. I want to achieve everything myself from scratch. It's important for me to realise what I'm worth without your money. Don't you understand? Shirley loved Brad very much, literally couldn't imagine life without him, and was terrified that he would prioritise his parents' opinion and leave her. And then there's this dismissal. Surely they will think that she got fired for being stupid. But the girl's fears were in vain. Brad hugged her, kissed her hard and consoled her. Don't be upset, my dear. Anything can happen. We'll celebrate the wedding, and then I'll help you find another job. I'm here for you. We're together. We'll manage. I love you. Always remember that. Shirley exhaled. I love you too, Brad. You're so great. I'm lucky to have you, and it's so good that we met back then. The day of the celebration came. Shirley put on a simple white dress and looked at herself in the mirror, smiling. It fit her perfectly. Her mood was wonderful. Today was the most important day of her life. A wedding. What could be more exciting for any girl? But her mother-in-law did not share her joy. They were waiting for the newlyweds, with her husband in the restaurant, lamenting. The mother of this hungry girl is coming now. I don't want to see her. What will she give to the young? She's got nothing. It's a disgrace. And where did our Brad find such a fool? He should think with his head instead of believing in love. The newlyweds entered the hall. The guests greeted them, and the fun began. Shirley's mother was dressed modestly, without frills, in a classic dress, with strict, discreet shoes. She wore a brooch and earrings as her only jewellery. When the woman stood up and took the microphone, Brad's mother snorted contemptuously. What a terrible dress! A la farewell to youth. As for Mrs. Fuller, she looks like an old teenager. The ultra-fashionable and provocative, expensive scarlet dress was ridiculous on a woman her age, and the huge number of diamonds and gold weighing down her neck made her image heavy. Mrs. Fuller tried to look younger, regularly injecting herself with Botox. Her face was absolutely smooth, without wrinkles, but it looked more like an inanimate mask than a youthful image. Meanwhile, Helen began to congratulate the newlyweds. My dear children, Shirley and Brad, today is the most important day of your lives, as you become husband and wife. I wish you happiness from the bottom of my heart. Love each other, respect and support. And I have a present for you. Here are the keys to the summer house in the countryside. There's a river nearby, a forest. You can relax there from the city. The house, of course, is old, but it can definitely be fixed up. Be happy. Mrs. Fuller even jumped in anger and hissed, Are you crazy? Why did you give our children a wrecked house in a remote village? Are you trying to finish us off and embarrass us? I don't know what to say, but what else could I expect from you? Helen cried, not expecting such a negative reaction. She had even taken a loan from the bank to buy the house. She felt humiliated and disgraced in front of everyone. Shirley ran after her, confused and almost tripping in her wedding dress. She caught up with her mother on the porch and hugged her, pleading, Mummy, where are you going? Please don't leave. Stay. Don't pay attention to Mrs. Fuller. Everyone knows she's quarrelsome. Thank you for such an unexpected gift. I know it's from the heart." Helen shook her head and replied, "No, my daughter. I can't stay. I have to go. Otherwise I won't be able to hold back and confront that insolent woman face to face. I don't want to spoil your special day. Be happy with Brad. Goodbye." Shirley returned to the wedding, sad and crying, looking at her mother-in-law with disdain. Mrs. Fuller was sitting there, pouting her over-pumped lips, and her son was telling her that such behaviour was unacceptable. He was ashamed of his parents. His father had given him a portion of the company's shares, but he could only receive dividends if he took over his father's business. However, Brad had repeatedly expressed that business was not his thing, but his father was stubborn. As a result, the wedding turned into a quarrel, and the joy of the occasion was wholly ruined. A couple of months went by, and Shirley couldn't find a job. Everywhere she looked, experience was required. But how could a young girl like her gain experience? Things weren't going well for Brad either. There were fewer and fewer job opportunities in his field, despite having recently received his diploma. His father deliberately blocked all his bank accounts as a way to teach his disobedient son a lesson. He hoped that Brad would suffer and eventually return to him and become a businessman. The money given as a wedding gift quickly disappeared, and the couple didn't have enough to pay the rent for the next month. They sat in despair in the kitchen wondering what to do next. Suddenly, Brad exclaimed, "Shirley, what fools we are! Your mother gave us a house in the countryside. Can't we at least go and see it? Who knows, maybe we'll like it." Shirley looked at him sceptically and replied, "Brad, don't make me laugh. You, a city boy who grew up in luxury, are going to the village. I can hardly imagine myself there. Of course, it wasn't a good idea of my mum. But you're right, it's worth taking a look. Maybe it can be a nice summer house for us." The next day the couple set off early in the morning for the village. It was a long journey, and the road was bumpy. So in the evening they finally arrived. When they saw the gifted property, Brad whistled and said, "Yeah, the house is old. It must have been a manor house. Look at the carvings on the shutters, and the arched entrance with interesting columns. But its condition is deplorable. It needs plenty of repairs. The roof tiles have crumbled in places, causing leaks, and the corner of the roof is bent, possibly due to foundation problems. I can only imagine what awaits us inside." Shirley was quite upset, looking at the huge, gloomy and abandoned house. It looked more like a barn than an estate. She muttered under her breath, "My mum must have been crazy. It's impossible to live here. What a gift. It's in the middle of nowhere, and it's practically falling apart. I don't even want to go inside. Let's leave. There's nothing to do here. We've just wasted our time." But Brad wandered around the yard, stood on a hillside and gasped, "Shirley, don't be angry. Come here and see it for yourself. Your mother did something good. Don't be so quick to judge. Look at how beautiful it is. It's mesmerizing." The view was indeed spectacular. On the left, there was a forest with huge pine and fir trees, and on the right there were wheat fields. Not far away, the river seemed to merge with the endless blue sky. Combined with the vibrant sunset, it was truly beautiful. Brad became enthusiastic and led Shirley inside to explore the property. They unlocked the rusty door and entered. The smell of dampness and mice overwhelmed them. There were 5 large bedrooms with high ceilings, but their condition was truly deplorable. The plaster had become damp and was sagging to shreds. The floor was rotten in places and the boards creaked with every step. Shirley coughed and said, "What a nightmare, so dusty. How can anyone live here? What should we do? I can't even imagine." But her husband already had a well-defined plan in his head, and he began to tell it with fervour. There's a lot of work to do, of course, you're right. But if we do it gradually, one room at a time, we will have done it by the fall. The main thing is to repair the roof and the furnace first, then fix the well. But look at it from the other side. We currently live in a rented apartment, both of us without stable jobs. We pay a lot of money every month to our landlord, while we have our own place. There is a lot of land here, and we can have a little vegetable garden. There are also yard buildings available, so over time we can farm. There's plenty of space, clean air, grace and silence. Let's take a chance. I looked around as we were driving and realised that the village wasn't so abandoned. There's a store, a post office and even a school. Shirley looked at her husband, dumbfounded, and said, "Well, you surprise me. I thought you would be the first to run away from here, because it's a lot of hard work, and yet you've made plans. Well, I'm your wife now, so whatever you decide, that's how it's going to be. Where you go, I go. There's no other way. I'll try to get used to it and love this place, although it's a little creepy to be honest, but together we'll probably get through it." Brad kissed Shirley, saying, "We'll definitely cope, on our own. I don't want to live on my father's handouts. Do you understand? It's important for me to make my own way in life, and I've loved nature since childhood. It's a bad start, but as they say, the eyes fear, but the hands do the work. So, what's up? Shall we move? Is it decided?" Shirley nodded and said, "Decided. I believe in you." When Mrs. Fuller learned that her son and daughter-in-law were leaving everything behind to live in the village, she made a wild scandal. "Son, are you crazy, or have you fallen into some kind of sect? Where are you going? You're a certified specialist. Don't be silly. Go to work for your father. You'll be living comfortably. Is it better for you to be mowing hay with a scythe? I know it's your Shirley who's confusing you. It's all because of her." But Brad just waved her away and said, "Mum, you can't hear me. I don't want to go to my father. Do you understand? I'm not interested. I'm not going to fight and live under such stress every day. I don't have that kind of temperament. I'm going to make it on my own. And stop insulting my wife. If you want to know, I'm the one who convinced her to settle there. Stay out of my life. We'll sort it out ourselves." Mr. Fuller only laughed and said, "Let him go to this damn hole. I can even bet that in a month at most he'll be back home with mud on his boots. He'll come home and ask me for help. You see, he doesn't like my money-making schemes. Nothing. Money doesn't smell. That's even better. He'll soon realise what he's missing and get smarter." On the contrary, Shirley's mother was pleased that the children decided to move and volunteered to help them with the repairs, especially since she was on vacation. The first thing they did was buy and bring building materials, hire a crew, and got down to business with great zeal. However, the money quickly ran out, leaving only enough for the exterior work, so they had to do the rest of the work by themselves. Helen said, "Tomorrow morning we'll start stripping the walls. The plaster is holding badly, so we'll have to put it on again, and only then will we paste the wallpaper." At first, Shirley moaned and wailed. Her body whimpered and ached from unaccustomed hard work. She wanted to give up everything and return to the apartment, where there was comfort, a shower, and a soft bed. But her mother quietly encouraged her, saying, "Be patient, daughter. It's hard at first, but then you'll get used to it and get involved. The repairs will be done, and it will be easier. You have such a wonderful husband. Be proud. Do you think he doesn't get tired? He's never wielded a shovel before, and now he's got bloody blisters from unaccustomed use. He's tired to the point of shaking in his knees, wet with sweat. But he's still cheerful. He doesn't show it. A real man. You can't find a man like him nowadays, so don't grumble and show him affection once in a while. Then there'll be peace in the family. Family, Shirley, is not only romance and beautiful bouquets, but also a sea of difficulties and you need to be able to survive them together, shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes forgive, sometimes keep silent. I was young and stupid. I didn't appreciate love, and it was all for nothing. It's very hard for a woman to be alone without a good and loving husband. So take care of Brad. My son-in-law is a very good man. The following day they began working on the walls. Progress was swift, as the room was damp, and the plaster easily came off. However, when they reached the wall of the hall, they encountered a problem. There was a thick layer of mixture that seemed to be firmly attached to the wall. Brad, already soaked, grabbed a crowbar and painstakingly chipped away at it, millimetre by millimetre. Suddenly, the sound became metallic, as if the iron tool had struck something metal. Curiosity got the better of the man, and he started hammering with double speed. That's when they discovered a secret door. Shirley pulled it open, and it swung open easily. Inside the alcove, there was a heavy chest. The three of them managed to lower it to the floor. When Brad opened it, they were all astonished. The chest was filled with treasure. Literally, it was packed to the brim with earrings, necklaces and rings, all with tags indicating they were from a jewellery store. At the bottom, there were bundles of money. Shirley, in a state of excitement, tried on the rings, placing one on each finger, and exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, how beautiful! We've stumbled onto a treasure. We'll be rich. There are millions here. We're so lucky, Brad. Can you believe it? You've given us a royal gift, Mummy." However, Helen brought their excitement down a notch. She said, "Hold on, guys. Let's not get crazy. These items are obviously stolen. They all have tags, and they're clearly not historical or valuable treasures. What should we do? Brad, what do you think? According to the law, we should hand them over to the authorities, and we might be rewarded for it." Brad scratched the back of his head and sadly replied, "Unfortunately, you're right. We won't be able to sell them without getting in trouble. We don't know who they belong to or when they were taken. The police might have additional information. As for the money, we should turn that in too, for the sake of our conscience. Maybe it's blood money, who knows? For now, let's leave everything as it is. Helen, who did you buy the house from? Maybe the previous owner knows something, although, if he did, would he have left such treasures?" Helen pondered for a moment and said, "I've been thinking, what could I give you for your wedding? Suddenly, I saw an ad for a house for sale in the village at an incredibly low price. I called and met the owner. At first, he seemed unreliable to me, with his restless eyes and tattoos, looking like a convict or a heavy drinker. His face was wrinkled, and he had very few teeth. He was quite repulsive looking, but the documents were clean, and I checked them at a notary just to be safe. I fell in love with the place at first sight. The river is so clean, you can see the bottom, and the air is so fresh. So I bought it. I thought that if you didn't like it, I would retire there myself and give you my apartment." Brad looked at Helen with respect and said, "Thank you for taking care of us. You're a good mother. You're caring and compassionate. Shirley is just like you, kind and thoughtful. That's why I love her." Since all of this happened on Saturday, they decided to take the treasure to the police after the weekend. Meanwhile, they continued repairing the house, and the process was even faster. On that warm and peaceful evening, no one could have anticipated the trouble that was about to unfold. Shirley and her mother were busy in the kitchen, preparing a salad and setting the table. Brad was just hammering the last nails into the bench to make it less wobbly when 2 thugs burst into the yard. Their hardened faces and slang immediately revealed that they were convicts. They descended upon the bewildered Brad, shouting, "Hey, where's our gold? Give it back now or we'll break your and your chickens' necks. We have nothing to lose." Although Brad was from a wealthy family and had never engaged in street fights, he was athletic and had practiced karate since childhood. He immediately fought back, saying, "Get out of our house. It's ours, and there's nothing of yours here anymore. Do you understand?" Shirley rushed out onto the porch and upon seeing what was happening became terrified and screamed. Helen quickly assessed the situation and said, "Run quickly after the district police officer and ask for help. Don't stand still. Run as fast as you can." Shirley ran through the backyard, shouting to the whole street, "Help! Good people, there are bandits attacking my husband. Someone, please help us." By the time the girl reached the police post, several local men, armed with pitchforks and axes, were already running towards our hero's house. In the village, there was a strong sense of community, and everyone rushes to help in times of misfortune. Helen was also defending her son-in-law from the bandits. She fiercely waved a shovel and shouted, "Stay away from him! I won't let you harm Brad! Get out of here!" Despite his determination, Brad was eventually wounded by one of the bandits with a broken bottle. Fortunately, the locals quickly came to their aid. While Shirley and the local police officer rushed to the scene, a chaotic fight broke out in the yard, with everyone trying to subdue the bandits. Eventually, the bandits were captured and tied to a pole. The convicts growled like wild beasts, breathing heavily and spitting out blood. The chairman of the village accompanied Brad and Shirley to the medical station to treat his wounds. Meanwhile, Helen, sobbing, recounted the events. "We were about to have dinner when these bandits broke in. They demanded the treasure we had accidentally discovered. They threatened to kill us if we didn't comply. Brad, being a brave young man, stood up to defend our family. I don't know what would have happened if the neighbours hadn't arrived in time." The surprised police officer asked, "Did you really find a treasure?" Helen nodded and explained, "Yes. Yesterday, while doing repairs, we removed some plaster and found an old chest hidden in the wall. It contained obviously stolen goods from a jewellery store, brand new, with tags. We planned to turn it in to the police, but we didn't have the chance. Apparently these criminals robbed the jewellery store, and not just one. It's unbelievable. We need to get rid of the stolen jewellery as soon as possible." An hour later, the stolen treasure was taken as evidence, and the bandits were sent to the police station. There was no mention of any compensation. However, Helen was relieved that everything had ended well. A paramedic treated Brad's wounds, which thankfully were not deep. Shirley took care of her husband, bandaging his injuries and bringing him hot tea and sandwiches. Brad grinned and said, "Our opportunity to become millionaires didn't work out, Shirley, but I'm grateful for your care. I was so scared for you. If something bad had happened, I wouldn't have been able to bear it." Shirley crossed herself and replied, "It's all right. We'll manage on our own, just as we planned. I don't want millions, if it means putting our family at risk. By the way, Tanya offered me her chickens. She doesn't have the strength to take care of them anymore. Why don't we give it a try? You've always dreamed of farming, right? Let's start with something simple." Brad laughed, embraced his wife tenderly, and kissed her on the nose. "That's coming from someone who grew up in the city. Of course, let's give it a try. We have to start somewhere." Brad prepared a fence and a shed, while Shirley whitewashed them. They acquired their first pets, 20 cute little chicks. Shirley followed the instructions of the elderly neighbour, and soon the chicks grew into healthy chickens, and Shirley was proud of herself. The repairs on the house also progressed slowly, with the help of their supportive neighbours. They were pleased and surprised that such young people decided to live in the village, as most people nowadays move to the city searching for a comfortable and prosperous life. In addition to the chickens, Brad and Shirley took in a dog named Teddy, who was given to them by the chairman, and a cat named Thomas. They even took the risk of raising a calf. This was their new life. Helen often visited them on weekends, helping helping and spending time with them. She enjoyed being in the old house even though it wasn't fully settled. There was a kind of calmness about it. Unfortunately, Brad had no communication with his parents. After an ugly scandal involving his mother, he didn't even want to call them. He was deeply hurt by their lack of understanding and support. But soon he learned so many bad things about his father that it frightened him to the core. It had been almost 3 months since the arrest of the 2 convicts. They had escaped from prison while they were serving sentences for robbing multiple jewelry stores. During the second investigation, the convicts confessed everything. There was no point in hiding, since they were facing life sentences for killing a guard during their escape. It turned out that these convicts robbed jewelry stores based on a tip from another man, who planned the robberies and took his share. However, during the robbery of the last store, the thieves hesitated and set off the alarm system, forcing them to flee, rushing. As they fled, they frantically tried to figure out where to hide the loot to avoid getting caught by the police. They also wanted to deceive the spotter and keep the loot for themselves. One of the bandits remembered that his former cellmate had inherited a house in a remote abandoned village. Therefore, they decided to hide their stolen goods in a secret compartment in the wall of that house, making sure they were well disguised. Unfortunately, the burglars were eventually caught by the police. Through a lawyer, the spotter warned the convicts that if they tried to betray him, he would get rid of them in their cells on the first night. The burglars got scared and knew that it was better to obey the criminal authority, so they kept silent and claimed that they had robbed alone and threw away the stolen jewelry and money on the highway, where they didn't remember. The burglar's brother-in-law was instructed to keep an eye on the house. However, they didn't anticipate that the house owner would sell the house all of a sudden. Brad listened to all this and, at the end, asked the investigator, "What are people? They don't stop at anything. Just a whole detective story. But you did not tell the main thing. Who was the spotter? In fact, he was responsible for the whole thing. And why did you call me? I'm not involved in this story, except for the fact that I found this stolen jewelry, because of which I also suffered." The elderly investigator sighed heavily and said, "That's the thing, Brad, that I called you not just for nothing, but to share the news. I have unpleasant news. As it turned out, the customer of all these robberies was your father, Mr. Fuller. All his business is just a screen, a cover. In fact, he has long been known as a well-known personality in criminal circles, but he was always in the shadows, never getting his hands dirty. That's why, for so many years, we could not solve his dark deeds. Now that he's under investigation, he's looking at a decent sentence with confiscation of all his property. That's the way it is, Brad. Did you know anything about your father's illegal activities?" Brad sat there, mouth open, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. "Are you absolutely sure? How is this possible? Honestly, I refused to get involved in my father's business from the start. He always made risky deals, and I couldn't handle that. But the fact that he was involved in criminal activities and even robbed jewelry stores, I can't believe it. Oh my God. Can I see him? I need to look him in the eye and ask him myself. Then I'll understand everything. Wait a minute. If my father is on trial and everything has been confiscated, where's my mother? We just had a quarrel before I left the village, and we haven't been in contact at all." The investigator shrugged. "I don't know for sure. You'll have to find out yourself. But as for visiting your father, I'll take care of arranging it. I sympathize with you, Brad. It's definitely not good news. But what can you do?" Brad went to his mansion in the city, but it was sealed shut with no one inside. He started calling family and friends, only to find out that after his father's high-profile arrest, they wanted nothing to do with him. Many didn't even answer the phone, and those who did irritably claimed ignorance about his mother's whereabouts. They asked him not to call again, fearing damage to their reputation. Brad was a nervous wreck, clueless about where his mum could be. Where was she? Maybe she needed help. After all, his father's accounts were obviously frozen, and his mother had never worked anywhere. Brad arrived home in the village late, nearly midnight. Shirley was deeply worried and embraced him tightly. He told her everything about his father's arrest, the thieves, and his concerns about his mother. Shirley hugged him tightly and said, "If your mother has nowhere to go, she can live with us. I'll tolerate it. We can't leave her on the streets. There's plenty of room for everyone here, although she will have to adjust to a simpler lifestyle here." Brad kissed his wife, expressing gratitude for her understanding. He knew his mother had hurt Shirley in the past, but now was not the time to assign blame. They needed to find her and offer support. "You're a real treasure. Let's go to bed. I'm exhausted. Today has brought so much bad news. My head is spinning." Just as the couple finished clearing the table and were about to go to bed, there was a loud knock at the window. Shirley shuddered. She had not yet forgotten how the last unexpected visit had ended. She whispered, "Brad, don't go. Who could come at this late hour? I'm afraid." The man himself became nervous but didn't show it. He threw on his jacket and went out the house. The dog was barking furiously, having smelled a stranger. And then Brad heard the voice of his neighbour Richard. "Brad, Shirley, are you home? I've brought you a guest. Your mother came to visit but got lost, went the wrong way, almost all the way to the forestry. And I was just coming from the neighbouring village when I bumped into such a fashionable lady." And indeed, Brad saw his mother, covered in mosquito bites and crying. She had broken heels and the wheel of her suitcase, torn stockings and scratched legs. She could hardly stand from fatigue. The man rushed to hug her. "Mummy, you're here. It's so good that you've come. I searched all over the city for you yesterday, but no one knew anything about you. Why didn't you call? I would have met you." Mrs. Fuller suddenly sobbed pitifully. I don't know. I was ashamed, to be honest. I hurt you and Shirley so much. My daughter-in-law was not treated like a human being, and only now, when I've had a lot of suffering myself, I realise how wrong I was. I'm sorry, my son. Will you take your mother in? You won't kick me out. I have nowhere to live. Your father is imprisoned, and the house is confiscated." Brad took the suitcase and thanked his neighbour. "Thank you, Richard, for bringing my mother. I owe you one. Come over tomorrow evening and we'll get to know each other properly." "Mum, don't be silly. Let's go inside quickly." Shirley fussed around her mother-in-law, set the table, warmed up tea, made her bed in the spare bedroom, and made her hot bath. Mrs. Fuller sat quietly like a mouse and watched her daughter-in-law. She thought to herself, "What a good girl. Kind, hard-working, and pretty. Why did I foolishly hold a grudge against her?" Meanwhile, Shirley said, "I've put a warm robe for you there, though it's not super fashionable, but it's better to put it on because it's cold in the house. You'll definitely freeze in your silk pyjamas, especially after the bath. Do you have slippers, or do you want some warm socks?" Mrs. Fuller suddenly looked intently at her daughter-in-law and took her hand. "Shirley, my child, forgive me, a wicked, foolish woman. I was wrong to judge you and quarrel with my son. And now as I look at you, I can't find a better daughter-in-law. Let's forget all the wrongs, shall we? I promise I won't be temperamental anymore. I'll help you. I'm not really suited to village life, but I'll try. We'll live as one friendly family." Shirley was very pleased with these warm and sincere words. She felt that her mother-in-law was speaking from the heart. "I am not vindictive. Everything will be fine. It only seems like life in the village is so hard and terrible. I thought so too at first. I got tired a lot and wanted to cry, especially when we planted a vegetable garden for the first time in our lives. I spent half the night moaning from back pain. But you know, there are huge advantages. Clean air, freedom, and no noise and bustle. And what about nature? We'll go to the river tomorrow, and you'll definitely fall in love with it. And the people here, they are maybe not aristocrats, but kind and helpful. When we were attacked by those bandits, half the village came to help us. Is that possible in the city? People live side by side for years and don't know their neighbours. Brad is building a farm, by the way. We'll have our own income, so we won't be lost. And I'm grateful to you for your son. I love Brad so much. He's the best. A week later, Brad and his mother went to the city to see his father. They were allowed to meet. Mrs. Fuller was anxious because, since her husband's arrest, they had never seen each other again. Brad didn't know what he would say to his father either. Shout, accuse, forgive. Their relationship had always been difficult. Since childhood, Mr. Fuller tried to suppress his son's interests, pressured him, and tried to make him his assistant. But Brad was different. He loved nature and silence, and was kind, honest, and open. He didn't want to become a heartless tradesman. This confrontation between father and son lasted for many years. When Brad and his mother entered the meeting room, they were shocked. There was no trace of the self-confident, successful businessman. In front of them sat a tired and thin old man. Brad looked into his father's eyes intently and asked him directly, "Dad, is this all true? Was the business just a cover? And have you actually been involved in criminal activities for a long time? I still can't believe it. If it's a lie, just tell me. I'll hire a lawyer and we'll get you out." He lowered his head sullenly.
"Well, I understand your shock at hearing about me. Yes, son, it's true, even though I'm terribly ashamed. No one, not even my beloved wife, ever knew what I was really doing. I always thought that money didn't smell no matter how you got it. I guess that's wrong. But I did my best for you, so that you, dear, could live like a queen and not deny yourself anything. How many times have you been abroad? And you, Brad, did you need anything when you were a child? You had everything. The best tutors, classes, swimming pool, karate, and fashionable things. I wanted you to be like me too. But you're different. Too kind, too soft, and it made me angry. A mama's boy. You were always closer to her than you were to me. I thought your desire to marry Shirley and your going to the country were bliss. It pissed me off. How could it be? I'm the king of life and my son is a loser. I was sure you wouldn't last a week in this neck of the woods. And only when you almost got killed because of my past deeds, when I got here, in prison, did I get a real sentence. It's the only time I've rethought my life. I've realized a lot of things. You're not worse than me. You're better than me, son. You didn't get involved in adventures. You didn't take the easy way out, even though you could have lived happily on my money. You chose love. You didn't betray Shirley and went against everyone. You did the right thing. It's your choice and I respect it now. I'm proud of you, son. And I sincerely apologize that all these years, instead of just loving you as you are, I tried to remake you for myself. I've made many mistakes and done nasty things, and now I'm very sorry for it. It's a pity I can't go back." Brad could not hold back tears. He came and hugged his father tightly, whispered to him, "No matter how you are still my dad, the most dear person, and I love you. I do not know how to be angry for a long time, and I forgive you." Mr. Fuller also hugged his wife and whispered to her how guilty he was and how much he loved her, knowing that he was saying goodbye to her forever. Time passed and life went on as usual. Brad rebuilt the farm behind the house and began to master this difficult business slowly. Shirley actively helped him with everything. They worked together from early morning until night, tirelessly. 6 months later, Shirley's mum came to live with them. She sold her apartment in the city, paid off the loan she had taken to buy the house,
and gave the rest of the money to the children. It was just enough to buy milking machines and the necessary equipment to produce farm cheese. The business grew, and soon entrepreneurs began to come to the farm to buy organic products like milk, cottage cheese and butter. All the household members lived amicably, and all the grudges and misunderstandings were long forgotten. In the evenings, they drank tea with strawberry jam and discussed plans for the future. Richard, a neighbour, often joined them. The man was a widower. His wife had died of a heart attack 10 years ago, and his children had long started their own families. Over time, he developed a fondness for Shirley's mother, and he clumsily tried to care for her. One evening, Richard arrived at their tea gathering, dressed in formal attire, a white pressed shirt, grey pants with ironed creases and polished shoes. He was cleanly shaven, and the scent of men's cologne wafted from him. In his hands, he held a bouquet of chrysanthemums. Brad whistled and exclaimed, "Richard, you look stunning. What's the occasion? Is it your birthday? Or are you getting married?" Richard coughed, looked deeply into Helen's eyes, and firmly declared, "Brad, you're almost right. I came here to ask for Helen's hand. I can't live without her. She's constantly on my mind. Helen, in front of your entire family, I officially ask you for your hand in marriage. I may not be a wealthy man, but I have a good house. Having a partner like you would be a dream come true. I admire your garden, and it fills my heart with joy. You tend to it with such love. If I don't meet your expectations, please tell me. We're no longer young children. Please take your time to consider and give me your answer. And this bouquet, it's from the bottom of my heart." Everyone was stunned, clapping and staring at Helen. She blushed like a schoolgirl, feeling relatively ridiculous in her home polka-dot dress, while this man was openly confessing his love for her. Richard was also to her liking. They had many conversations about life, and he was a decent man who didn't drink much, only on holidays like everyone else. But to get married at this stage in her life? After years of being alone, she had forgotten what it was like to live with a man. She had long given up on the idea of finding happiness as a woman. However, she yearned for someone to love her, believe in her, support her, and be by her side. The woman looked guiltily at everyone and began to mumble, "Well, you certainly know how to surprise me. I'm even flustered. You're a handsome man and an excellent host, and to be honest, I like you too. But how can I leave my children? I promised to help them. There's so much work to do in the garden and on the farm." Shirley laughed heartily, looked at her husband and interjected, "Mum, we're not infants anymore. We can manage on our own. The most important thing is for you to be happy. We're all for it." Everyone joined in, laughing and chanting, "Cheers! Cheers!" Richard, undeterred, approached Helen, shyly embraced her, and kissed her. Something inside the woman exploded, and a wave of tenderness washed over her as she felt the strong, gentle touch of his hands on her waist. Goosebumps ran down her body, a sensation she had long forgotten. It was incredible how this old, dilapidated house had brought the entire family together in such a remarkable way. It had a special, positive aura that calmed and uplifted everyone. Soon, Shirley shared the joyous news with everyone. She was pregnant. Brad was overjoyed, jumping up and down like a child. Only Mrs. Fuller was initially shocked, looking at herself in the mirror and thinking, "I'm almost a granny, oh my goodness." However, she expressed her pride and happiness for her son in a letter to her husband. "You know you'll soon be a grandfather, so hang in there for the sake of your grandson and don't lose hope. Our son is different from us. He lives with his heart and loves sincerely, and I'm proud of him. Money isn't his priority. He doesn't indulge in unnecessary extravagance or try to prove anything to anyone. He simply works and loves his family, selflessly and sincerely, and that means a lot. I've also found something I enjoy here, making exquisite cheese using ancient recipes. So you can be proud of me. Even someone as refined as me can thrive in the countryside. We all remember you and love you. Come back soon." The old house was rejuvenated, no longer resembling an abandoned barn. It was infused with new life, as it had become younger, and beamed with its new windows and sprawling grapevines.